Theirs was a textbook romance between a young co-ed with a promising future
She had her whole life ahead of her.
and a dashing young man who swore to love her till death do they part.
They seem very happy living with one another and honeymooning and things of that nature. No problems, no issues, no nothing.
But less than a year after their sacred vows, an inexplicable crime shattered their lives.
She had been stabbed. It was a bloodbath.
Why? Why her? Why anybody? But definitely why her?
To unmask a killer, police would have to navigate a twisted path of sexual obsession, betrayal, and lies.
It was passionate, it was hot, and it was dangerous.
You just couldn't make this up if you tried.
You have a killer who is enraged, maybe even deranged or psychotic.
Wednesday, January 30th, 2008, 7:30 a.m. It's a cold winter morning in Raleigh, North Carolina. But as the sun rises over the city, morning commuters spot something alongside Interstate 540 that takes their breath away.
Several drivers headed west on I-540 noticed what appeared to be a body off to the side of the road.
As 911 calls pour into dispatch, first responders race to the scene.
16197.
There, they find a young woman lying in the grass. But sadly, it's much too late. She's dead.
The first thought that authorities probably had was that she was perhaps a pedestrian. Maybe she got hit by accident on the side of the road.
But when police take a closer look at the woman's body, they quickly realize this is no ordinary accident.
No, she's not been hit, she's been stabbed.
Okay, I'll get major crimes.
They can see that she has been stabbed repeatedly about her face and throat. It's apparent that she has been murdered.
Who exactly is this woman, and how did she get here? Investigators search the area for clues. But there's no trace of a murder weapon, nor are there any eyewitnesses to the crime.
They had canvassed the whole area, asking drivers if anybody had seen anything. But this was basically along a stretch of very busy highway.
One of those commuters is a man named Darren Curtis. At approximately 7:45 a.m., he drives by the crime scene and, like many, slows down to take a look.
On his way to work on I-540, Darren notices traffic is backed up. He passes a crime scene. He sees a body under a blue tarp. Just a half mile later, he spots a white car, strongly resembling his wife's, on the side of the road.
Darren's curiosity quickly turns to panic. The vehicle definitely belongs to his wife, Latrice. Frantic, Darren Curtis goes back to the crime scene he just passed. Detectives confirm Darren's worst fear. The deceased woman is indeed his wife, beautiful 21-year-old Latrice Curtis. Darren isn't the only one to feel the stinging loss. Latrice's father soon learns the devastating news.
I've got some really bad news. Latrice is dead.
All kind of things went through my head, man. I didn't know whether to be mad. I didn't know who to start blaming. Like, okay, this is a dream. Okay, we're gonna wake up in a minute and it's gonna be over with, man.
But it's not a dream. It's a nightmare. One that's just beginning to unfold. As police attempt to uncover the truth, they'll descend into a world of dark secrets and twisted fantasies.
They've had this extramarital, possibly salacious, risque relationship.
It seemed that everyone in this case was keeping secrets, and I mean everyone.
Latrice Curtis grew up in a loving home full of big brothers.
Being the only girl, she got the special attention. She got to get away with things that the boys never got away with.
Blessed with good looks and an infectious smile, Latrice was one of the most popular girls in high school.
Latrice was always a people person. She could just walk up to you and just start a conversation. She was just adorable.
It was no surprise that Latrice had more than her fair share of male admirers. But this driven young woman always put her education first.
Latrice was a good student. She just wanted to succeed.
That hard work paid off when Latrice was accepted into a local college in Raleigh. And it was during her very first semester
Sorry.
that she met a dashing and ambitious accounting student named Darren Curtis.
Excuse me. Is it okay if I sit here? Sure.
They seem to mesh with each other pretty well.
What are you working on? Something for my psychology class. Nothing major. What do you have for psych this year? Dr. Brown. Oh, I'm sorry.
Latrice and Darren instantly hit it off, and it wasn't long before the studious pair became an item.
It was definitely special. It was different in every way. She loved him.
Would you want to come with me? Grab a bite?
Soon after Darren and Latrice started dating, she introduced him to her family. Right away, they could tell there was something different about Darren. A former National Guard soldier, he was respectful, mature, and quickly won them over.
After I spoke with him, my perception of him actually changed. You know, he was a really good kid.
Did you have fun tonight?
I did.
Good.
I enjoyed myself.
Latrice and Darren were so head over heels in love that just 1 year into their relationship, they decided they should spend the rest of their lives together.
Latrice, will you marry me?
Yes!
After saying I do, the couple moved into a cozy apartment, and Latrice transferred to prestigious North Carolina Central University in nearby Durham to finish her degree in business administration. But despite their long hours apart, Latrice seemed ecstatic about her and Darren's future together.
She was just starting out her life, her married life, her professional life. She was really just somebody that had her whole future ahead of her.
But on the morning of January 30th, 2008, just 9 short months after her wedding day, that future is severed in the most horrific way imaginable.
This is a senseless, shocking crime. I mean, who in the world would do something like this?
As police expand the search for Latrice's killer, what they don't know is that this search will lead them into a world of sex, lies, and hidden desires, where it seems everyone has something to hide. College students Darren and Latrice Curtis shared a love that knew no bounds. But just 9 months into their marriage, their lives were torn apart when police found Latrice brutally stabbed to death on the side of a North Carolina interstate. Surprisingly, one of the first people at the scene was her husband, Darren.
He actually drove out by the scene and saw his wife's car out there.
While first responders try and console Darren, investigators begin processing the bloody scene.
Latrice Curtis was brutally assaulted in this homicide. She was stabbed upwards of 40 times about her face, her neck, her chest, her torso. Her carotid artery was slashed open. Her jugular vein was slashed open. Her vocal cords were cut.
Man, she's got 20 or 30 stab wounds.
I mean, it didn't look like it's a robbery. She's got her earrings.
Although investigators still have no idea what prompted Latrice's violent death, one thing is certain.
Look at her hands.
Yeah, looks like she's been fighting.
She hadn't gone down without a fight.
It looks like there's been a struggle.
Hey, man, can you bag the hands? Yeah. Thank you.
The victim's fingernails were examined, and it was pretty clear that there was some injury or damage to her nails.
As CSIs bagged Latrice's hands, detectives head a half-mile down the interstate to the location of Latrice's abandoned vehicle. It's immediately apparent that a struggle has taken place inside.
The center console is broken, and it looks like blood is on the driver's side door.
But what is Latrice's car doing so far away from her body? An examination of the vehicle suggests someone other than Latrice drove her car last.
There was a DNA sample left on Latrice's car on the steering wheel.
While CSI send the DNA evidence they collected from both Latrice's car and her fingernails to the state crime lab for analysis, detectives ponder the killer's possible motive.
The question really is, who would want to hurt her, and who would want to kill her so violently and so brutally?
It's the same question Latrice's heartbroken family is asking.
Why? Why her? Why anybody? But definitely, why her?
Is it possible Latrice had been the tragic victim of a random crime? To investigators, that theory seems unlikely.
When a person is murdered in a way like this, it looks so personal, so filled with hate.
You don't need to stab someone 40 times to kill them. So if you're stabbing someone 40 times, you are enraged, you are angry.
But just who could be that angry with a good girl like Latrice? With her family at a loss, police turn to the man closest to Latrice, her husband, Darren.
About what time did you see Latrice?
Darren explains that the last time he'd spoken to his wife was the previous evening around 10 p.m.
How did she seem to you? Was she upset or normal?
She seemed fine.
She calls her husband to say, I'm running late from school and I'm gonna get something to eat, so I'll be late getting home.
Around 11:30, Darren goes to sleep. He hasn't heard from his wife, Latrice, but figures she may have gone to eat at her family's home and perhaps just stayed there.
Darren says that when he woke up the next morning, he telephoned Latrice, but the call went straight to voicemail.
Just calling to check on you, making sure you're okay. If you would, just give me a call back whenever you get this. Bye.
Darren assumed Latrice might still be asleep, so he decided to shower and then left for work around 7:30 a.m.
On his way to work that morning on I-540, Darren notices traffic is backed up. He then passes a crime scene with yellow tape and a body under a blue tarp.
Darren says he felt a knot in his stomach as he passed the scene, and then just moments later spotted his wife's car.
So you just happened to be driving by, or what? Why'd you stop?
Man, I was on my way to work. I take the 540 every day.
While Darren's story sounds plausible, it seems awfully coincidental to detectives that he discovered his wife's car and arrived at the crime scene before police contacted him.
From outside, everything looked fine between Darren and Latrice. But was there something about their marriage that no one knew about?
Detectives decide to take Darren down to the station for further questioning.
Darren, unbutton your sleeves, please. Let me see your hands and your arms.
Darren is questioned and photographed. They're looking for cuts and abrasions.
Unbutton your collar up there for me.
There are no outward signs Darren has been in any type of physical altercation. Still, investigators have a few hard questions they need to ask him.
Tell me about you and Latrice. Were you having any marital problems or anything?
No, we loved each other.
Do you mind if we checked your house and your car?
You guys can do whatever you need to do.
With Darren's blessing, police search the apartment, but find no signs of a struggle in the couple's home or in Darren's car.
There's absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the crime scene.
Okay, Darren. You're gonna be free to leave, all right? But don't leave town.
Detectives released Darren that afternoon, but upon receiving Latrice's autopsy report, they make a shocking discovery.
When the autopsy was done on Latrice Curtis's body, there was a condom found.
This condom found inside her during the autopsy tells law enforcement that she may have had intercourse recently.
But judging by her injuries, it doesn't appear Latrice had been raped.
There were no injuries in her genital area consistent with sexual assault.
The discovery, however, raises more troubling questions. For starters, whose condom was it? And could sex have somehow sparked this vicious attack?
What's this number here?
With this case growing more salacious by the minute,
Does that look familiar?
investigators decide to subpoena Darren and Latrice's phone records.
It's Darren.
Pouring through the call log, Darren's story appears to check out.
So he called her at 10, and the next morning, just like he said he did.
But to their surprise, Latrice also made and received a flurry of calls from another number around midnight before she was murdered.
There's a bunch of calls from that number. It says it comes back to a Stephen Randolph.
Who is Stephen Randolph? The answer to that question would prove to be one of the keys to unlocking the mystery behind Latrice's death. And his new wife, Latrice, hoped to build a beautiful life together. But those dreams appear to have died on the side of a North Carolina freeway when Latrice was found brutally stabbed to death.
She was really a young woman that was just starting out her life. She had her whole life ahead of her.
Police have already questioned and released Darren. But phone records, along with a condom found inside Latrice's body, have cops wondering if the last person she had contact with, a man named Stephen Randolph, is somehow involved in this crime.
Law enforcement have questions for him. They're going to want to look really closely at Stephen Randolph.
While police begin searching for Stephen, investigators try and flesh out his connection to Latrice. Turns out, Stephen Randolph is one of the most eligible bachelors on NCCU's campus.
He was a very attractive young man. He was an athlete. He was a basketball player.
Randolph was trying to establish a career in the NBA as a professional basketball player.
So what's Stephen Randolph's connection to Latrice? While friends aren't 100% certain, they do tell investigators that Stephen and Latrice had definitely grown close in recent months.
They began socializing there and apparently some level getting interested in each other, perhaps flirting or something to that effect.
Were Stephen and Latrice more than just friends? The only person who can answer that question for certain is Stephen himself. Thankfully, it doesn't take police long to find him. 2 days after Latrice's body is discovered,
Excuse me, officer. Yes, sir.
Stephen walks into the Wake County Sheriff's Office.
Hey, my name is Stephen Randolph.
He walked through the front door of the sheriff's office like a gift.
I'm here to speak with a detective about the Latrice Curtis case.
But Stephen isn't alone.
CID, please.
Standing beside him is his roommate, a local pastor named Robert Reeves.
Stephen Randolph went to the police station with Robert Reeves in tow at Robert Reeves' insistence.
How's it going? How you doing? Hey, Ray, how you doing? Can you take him to my office, please, and I'll get this one?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
All right, sir, if you'll go right this way.
Yes, sir, officer.
Leading Stephen into an interrogation room, detectives get right to work.
So tell me about Latrice and you. How'd you know her?
We had a few classes together. We met back in September. Just friends.
Just friends?
Stephen tells detectives that as their friendship deepened, Latrice would sometimes stop by his house to study.
Okay, so you were just in class together, nothing more than that?
That's it.
But when confronted with phone records, along with the findings of their autopsy report, Stephen begins to backpedal.
I'm gonna go ahead and be honest with you. We had a private relationship.
Latrice came to see Stephen on the night of the murder. It was only the second time she had been there. And they had an intimate encounter.
They were just friends. But that relationship evolved into a passionate sexual affair.
So you wore a condom?
Yes. Actually, the condom got trapped inside of her.
They tried it, they couldn't get it out.
Stephen says Latrice told him she'd had better luck removing the condom in the privacy of her own bathroom and left his house around 10 p.m. A few minutes later, Stephen followed suit.
Stephen drove off to clear his head. After driving around for a while, he ended up at his girlfriend's home, Velma Newton.
According to Stephen, shortly after he arrived at Velma Newton's home, Latrice started blowing up his cell phone.
Was just going crazy about it.
She's going home to her husband with another man's used condom inside of her body. And she's talking with Steve about the possibility of her becoming pregnant as a result.
So that's what all the phone calls were about?
Yeah.
It was about that?
Yeah.
So you're telling me you didn't kill her?
No.
Stephen is adamant he had nothing to do with Latrice's murder. But why hadn't he been more forthcoming about their sexual affair? And had he really visited his girlfriend, Velma Newton, after having sex with Latrice?
Hey, Reverend, how are you, sir?
Hey, how are you, Detective?
Good.
Hoping to get to the bottom of things, police turned to Stephen's housemate, Robert Reeves. A 43-year-old pastor, Reeves is affectionately known as the Bishop in Durham's tight-knit evangelical community.
He was known as a very charismatic person. He worked as a motivational speaker.
Just got a few questions, if you don't mind. Can you tell me something about Stephen?
Actually, we met at a car wash.
Reeves tells police he met Stephen in late summer of 2007.
Stephen explains that he's fallen on hard times. He's out of money, needs a job, and perhaps a place to stay.
Seemed like a fine young man. I had the room at the time at my house.
Pastor Reeves offered to let Randolph live in a basement apartment in his house and only charged him about $300 a month for rent.
So according to Pastor Reeves, that fall, Stephen moved into the home Reeves shared with his sister. Still curious about the true nature of Stephen and Latrice's relationship, detectives ask Reeves about the events of January 29th. He confirms that Latrice had indeed stopped by their house that evening.
She came by to visit Stephen, and I was actually on my way to a church service.
Pastor Reeves told police that on the night of the murder, he saw Latrice's car parked outside of his house.
Reeves says at 8:15 p.m. he left the house to attend a church service and returned home around 11:30.
When you got back, were there cars there?
No, Stephen and Latrice, both cars were gone. Both cars were gone.
Reeves tells detectives that though he didn't notice anything unusual that night, The following morning, Stephen confided in him about a phone conversation he had with Latrice around midnight, something Stephen hadn't mentioned to police.
During the phone call, Latrice tells Stephen she wants to take their relationship to another level.
He didn't appear to have made any promises to Latrice. It sounds like it may have been more like a roll in the hay. Latrice, it sounds like, was more interested in his long-term relationship.
Based on the new intel provided by Pastor Reeves, police can't help but wonder if Latrice was more serious about their relationship than Stephen. If so, could Stephen have viewed Latrice and her potential pregnancy as a stumbling block on his road to the NBA?
An unwanted pregnancy for a guy who's about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract, or at least if he believes he is, it could be motive for him to not want her around anymore. That is a question mark, a red flag for police.
But it isn't the only red flag police uncover when speaking to Pastor Reeves about Stephen.
Steve did have a knife and sword collection he kept at home.
But police had only just begun to tap the surface of this tawdry tale. Soon, a startling discovery would reveal 4 lives on a collision course, a collision that culminated in bloodshed. It's now been more than 48 hours since Latrice Curtis was found stabbed to death along Interstate 540 in Raleigh, North Carolina. While Latrice's killer has yet to be identified, revelations of a torrid affair, as well as the statement of Stephen's roommate, revered Pastor Robert Reeves, have police wondering if Latrice's extramarital lover, college hoop star Stephen Randolph, has committed the crime.
Randolph and Latrice was having sex, and it appears that the condom got stuck inside of her. There might be a potential that she's pregnant, and with his desire to be an NBA player, that could be a motive to want to get rid of her.
A motive that seems to dovetail nicely with another startling revelation, that Stephen owns a collection of knives and swords.
We know that this victim was stabbed repeatedly with a knife.
Could one of these weapons have been used in the attack? Police decide to execute a search warrant of Randolph's home and car. But after hours of combing the 2 locations, they find no signs of either a struggle or a potential murder weapon. With their search yielding no evidence, detectives attempt to verify Stephen's alibi. To do so, they reach out to his girlfriend, Velma Newton.
Tell me about that night. Did Stephen come over?
Yeah, he came over to my apartment around 10 o'clock.
According to Velma, Stephen shows up at her house at about 10 o'clock and leaves about 1 o'clock in the morning. This is consistent with what Stephen says about what time he left.
But with the coroner's office placing Latrice's time of death somewhere between 1 and 2 a.m., Stephen's alibi isn't exactly airtight.
Velma Newton was asked specifically whether or not there was any unusual behavior on behalf of Stephen that night, the night that Latrice was murdered.
Do you think Stephen may have had something to do with this?
No, there's no way. I mean, he's such a great guy. There's no way he could have done something like this.
Did you have something to do with it?
No.
Is it possible Velma is trying to protect Stephen? Or worse, could she potentially be involved?
No.
But Velma's adamant they're both innocent of the crime. In fact, she believes whoever murdered Latrice Curtis might have been targeting her as well.
She received these very strange, anonymous, threatening phone calls.
They were calling, trying to break us up, pretty much. And they would call over and over and over again.
And the anonymous threats weren't just directed towards Velma.
There were many threatening phone calls to Stephen.
He is warned to stop doing what he's doing, or he's going to get hurt, perhaps jeopardizing his dreams of the NBA.
According to Velma, it wasn't long before the threats began to escalate.
One night after leaving Velma's apartment, Stephen goes to his car and discovers all 4 tires had been slashed.
For detectives, it's a stunning turn of events, which suggests someone didn't exactly approve of Stephen Randolph's sexual escapades.
Is this a coincidence? I mean, does this have anything to do with what happened to Latrice? Can these things be related?
CID.
But before detectives can make sense of the slashed tires and menacing phone calls,
Yes, Trooper.
they get a call from State Trooper Isaac Cooper.
The 29th. What time was it?
Cooper recounts a routine traffic incident he investigated along Interstate 540 on January 30th, around 1:30 a.m. just 6 hours before commuters discovered Latrice's body.
I was driving around checking for disabled vehicles. This vehicle was on the shoulder of 540 eastbound. It had its hazards lights on, so I stopped behind it to see if they were okay.
But when Cooper approached the vehicle, he found it empty. At that point, Cooper called in the vehicle's license plate. While waiting to hear back from dispatch, he scanned the area and spotted another vehicle on the opposite side of the freeway.
There was a white vehicle on the westbound side with its hazards lights on also.
Detectives instantly realized that Cooper's description of this second vehicle is a match for Latrice Curtis's car. Cooper explains that before he got a chance to run the second car's plates, dispatchers requested he respond to another incident. But before Cooper pulled away, he got an update on the first vehicle.
They ran the tag, they responded to me that the vehicle was not stolen, and it came back to Robert Reeves out of Durham, North Carolina.
That's Robert Reeves, as in Pastor Robert Reeves, beloved minister, friend, and roommate of prime suspect Stephen Randolph. But what's the pastor's car doing on the same road where Latrice Curtis's body was found? The answer to that question would not only divide a community, but force police to consider a motive much more twisted than they had previously imagined. Detectives in Wake County, North Carolina, are trying to solve the gruesome murder of 21-year-old college student Latrice Curtis.
This murder was brutal. This woman was stabbed in her face, her throat, her chest. It was a bloodbath.
In the wake of her death, detectives have discovered that the newly married Latrice had become embroiled in a steamy affair with fellow student Stephen Randolph.
Because Randolph had this extramarital relationship with Latrice and she ends up dead, law enforcement are gonna have questions for him.
Randolph's alibi isn't exactly airtight, nor is that of his other girlfriend, Velma Newton. But before investigators can zero in on the couple, the case takes another mysterious turn, one that involves Stephen Randolph's roommate, Pastor Robert Reeves.
There was a trooper driving by that area that night, and he saw Robert Reeves' car on the side of the road.
Had Stephen Randolph used the pastor's car to stalk and kill Latrice Curtis, then abandon the vehicle by the side of the road? Or was Pastor Reeves somehow involved in Latrice's death?
Have your seat.
Detectives have no choice but to bring Robert Reeves back in for another round of questioning.
Let's take it from the top one more time, okay?
Yes, sir.
So tell me again what you did that night.
Robert Reeves said that he was at church earlier in the evening and that he came home and that he stayed home and that he did not drive his car anywhere and that he was not on the side of I-540 that night.
But the pastor also acknowledges it's possible Stephen Randolph borrowed his car.
He had his own set of keys, so he could use it when he needed to use it, and the bishop had let him do that.
Hoping to verify the pastor's story, police reach out to his other roommate, his sister, Willa Mae Thorpe.
According to Reeves, he's at church, the same church that his sister says she was attending the very same night. But she says she never saw him there.
Why is Pastor Reeves lying about his alibi? Is he trying to protect young Stephen Randolph? Or could he be involved in the murder of Latrice Curtis?
Pastor, would you mind rolling up your sleeves for us?
As detectives questioned Reeves, they noticed he had some abrasions on his hands and arms.
You want to explain how you got those scratches? They look pretty deep.
Stephen and I were moving a nice desk. I was going backwards and fell. He scraped up this arm a little bit. Okay, sorry.
Reeves did agree to give a DNA sample.
Open your mouth for me.
Investigators send Pastor Reeves' DNA sample off to the lab.
We're done.
And wait for the results. In the meantime, they bring Stephen Randolph back in for a second interview.
Did you borrow Robert's car?
Yes, I borrowed his car before, but not recently.
Not only does Stephen deny borrowing Pastor Reeves' car the night of the murder, he claims to have no recollection of the pastor being injured while moving a desk.
Did he get hurt moving it?
Oh, no.
Injured in any way?
It was simple.
So there was no accident?
No.
But Stephen's not done. He informs detectives that recently the pastor seemed a little nosy. especially when it came to Stephen and Latrice's steamy romance.
He came in my room once after she left, and he was acting kind of weird, real strange.
After Latrice had left, Reeves comes down and enters Stephen's room. Reeves asked Stephen if he had relations with the woman who just left. Stephen said yes, he did.
According to Stephen, that's when Pastor Reeves asked a truly unusual question.
He asked Randolph if he had ever considered being a male escort, started asking him questions about the size of his penis, started asking him if he'd ever had oral sex done by a man, trying to persuade him that there's really no difference.
Ultimately, one of the things that he offered Stephen Randolph was he said, if you will give me oral sex, I will not charge you rent.
Stephen says he rebuffed Reeves' sexual advances, and the pastor quickly apologized. But according to Stephen, it was shortly after this bizarre encounter that he and girlfriend Velma began receiving anonymous threats and found their tires slashed. For police, it's a startling accusation. But could it possibly be true? To answer that question, police subpoena Pastor Reeves' cell phone records.
They discovered that Reeves had made several blocked calls to Stephen, blocked calls to Stephen's girlfriend, so in all likelihood it was Pastor Reeves who was making those threatening anonymous phone calls.
It became clear to investigators that Robert Reeves was jealous of anyone who was with Stephen Randolph because he was infatuated with Stephen Randolph.
Turns out, Reeves has also been hiding a long history of strange sexual behavior.
He had in the past sexually assaulted at least 2 other men or young boys.
He had this different life. He compartmentalized these 2 parts of his life. There was the pastor, and then there was, for lack of a better term, the sexual predator.
But just because Reeves harbored a secret and deep infatuation for his roommate doesn't necessarily mean he killed Latrice. Or does it? The DNA tests conducted on the pastor, as well as Latrice Curtis and her vehicle, provide some shocking new evidence.
Part of that DNA is Latrice's, but there's another mixture in there, and that belongs to Reeves. Why is his DNA inside of her car?
To investigators, the answer to that question is becoming increasingly apparent.
The belief is that Robert Reeves followed Latrice Curtis from his home that night to the highway where he killed her.
On February 2nd, 2008, police formally charged Pastor Robert Reeves with the murder of Latrice Curtis. The news leaves friends, family, and Durham's religious community stunned.
I was really angry, you know? I know that if I could have got close to him, that, I don't know what would happen, man. I don't know.
There was a complete and utter disbelief from the religious community when he was charged, that they just absolutely had to have the wrong guy.
But prosecutors believe they have the right man. And on September 29, 2009, Robert Reeves is led into a Raleigh courtroom to stand trial for the murder of Latrice Curtis. In their opening arguments, prosecutors paint a chilling picture of a man who'd grown increasingly obsessed with Stephen Randolph. That obsession, they believe, gave way to rage on the night of January 29, 2008.
He was jealous because he was obsessed with Stephen, and Stephen had rebuffed his advances.
Prosecutors assert that after Latrice parted ways with Stephen Randolph the night of the murder, Robert Reeves followed her along Interstate 540, somehow convinced her to pull over, then savagely attacked her.
Reeves killed Latrice to get her out of the way because Latrice was having sex with Randolph. And for some sick reason, he thought that if he got her out the way, then maybe Randolph might give Reeves a chance.
But as the defense points out, if jealousy was indeed their client's motive, why on earth would Pastor Reeves pick a busy interstate as the place to put this plan in motion?
One of the great mysteries of this case was how did Robert Reeves get Latrice Curtis to pull over to the side of the road? But she clearly did pull over, and then this encounter happened.
To bolster their case, Prosecutors point to the slew of evidence connecting Reeves to the crime. The DNA, the state trooper report, and the bizarre anonymous phone threats. Next, prosecutors call Stephen Randolph to the stand to testify. In lurid detail, he recounts the night when Pastor Reeves propositioned him.
There were several pastors from other churches that came to support him. Well, when all the facts started to come out, the pastors weren't sitting in the audience anymore.
But with Stephen Randolph on the stand, defense attorneys see an opportunity. They assert that the person with the most to gain from Latrice's death wasn't Reeves, but her lover and NBA hopeful, Stephen Randolph.
It might be that Steve felt threatened and trapped, possibly trapped by her, and felt that he needed to do something.
The defense also has an explanation for how Pastor Reeves' vehicle ended up at the crime scene around the time Latrice was murdered.
The defense made it clear that there was a possibility that Stephen Randolph could have been driving that car.
It's a compelling argument, but defense attorneys aren't done. They have one more bombshell to drop on the jury. A piece of evidence so startling that some in the courtroom can't help but wonder if the wrong man is standing trial for Latrice Curtis's murder. In a Wake County courtroom, Robert Reeves is on trial for the murder of beautiful college student Latrice Curtis. Prosecutors have alleged the motive behind this crime is the once respected pastor's sexual obsession with Latrice's paramour, Stephen Randolph.
Prosecution's case was Robert Reeves killed Latrice Curtis to keep her away from Steve that he was infatuated with.
But defense attorneys have argued that the man with the most to gain from Latrice's death was Stephen Randolph himself.
The defense argued at trial that it was really Stephen who wanted Latrice dead.
But what about the DNA evidence found in Latrice's car? Defense attorneys argue there's a logical explanation.
The defense at trial attempted to argue that maybe somehow this was some form of transfer DNA.
DNA doesn't stay in one place, it can move. So if she's in that home, she's gonna be exposed to all kinds of DNA, particularly on her hands. If she had put her hand on the doorknob, she could pick up the DNA of Robert Reeves.
And as defense attorneys are quick to point out, Reeves' DNA wasn't the only genetic material found at the crime scene.
There was DNA found under Latrice Curtis's fingernails. And that DNA did not belong to Robert Reeves. It belonged to Stephen Randolph.
That really kind of threw me for a loop.
But prosecutors tell the court there's a viable reason Stephen's DNA was found at the scene.
The prosecution argued that that DNA got under her fingernails when she was having sex earlier that night with Stephen Randolph.
As for the defense's transfer DNA theory, prosecutors argue there's simply too much of Robert Reeves' genetic material found at the scene for anyone but the pastor to have committed the crime.
While transfer DNA is possible, it is extremely implausible in this case in light of all the other testimony and evidence, like the fact that Reeves had all of these cuts and scratches on his arms, like the fact that Pastor Reeves claimed to be at church when his sister said he wasn't.
On October 7, 2009, the jury retires to deliberate Robert Reeves' fate. 2 days later, they return with their verdict: guilty.
The defendant, Robert Lee Adams Reeves, was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
When they found him guilty, one side of me, okay, we found the right man. Then another side of, this guy's still living. My sister's at a cemetery right now.
While the verdict is met with a mix of sadness and relief, the pain wrought by Reeves' twisted actions still lingers today, especially for Latrice's husband, Darren Curtis.
Darren was just a different person.
The neon glare of the Phoenix Strip does not slow down for the ghosts of the past, but in the blistering summer heat of 2001, a silent void opened in the desert sand that would swallow a family's sanity for 25 years. It began with an unmade bed, a glass of water left sweating on a nightstand, and the absolute evaporation of 19-year-old college student Chloe Mercer from her locked apartment near the university campus. For a quarter of a century, The case sat frozen under the clinical label of a missing persons report, gathering dust in the back bins of the Maricopa County Homicide Archives while a desperate community learned to live with a lingering, suffocating terror. Then, in the early months of 2026, a structural inspection of a long-abandoned storage facility near the interstate unreeled a chain reaction of shocking revelations centered around a water-damaged, hand-locked leather journal that had been buried beneath layers of dry clay. This was the sudden, devastating cracking of a Phoenix 2001 cold case that had defied every traditional investigative methodology, an explosive breakthrough where the victim's own diary rose from the grave to unlock a gruesome truth that would leave the entire desert community paralyzed by shock. The landscape of Phoenix in the summer of 2001 was an unforgiving expanse of blinding sun, shimmering asphalt, and a rapidly expanding suburban grid that made it terrifyingly easy for a predator to disappear between the cracks of the city's shifting population. Chloe Mercer was a brilliant, meticulous biology major who never deviated from her strict daily planner, never missed an appointment with her advisors, and kept in constant, rhythmic contact with her mother on the opposite side of the valley. Yet, at 7:15 a.m. on August 12th, her car remained parked in its assigned space at the complex, her keys and wallet were sitting undisturbed on the kitchen table, and her apartment door was closed but unlocked, creating an immediate, chilling paradox that sent an electric shock through the entire campus community. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, and no obvious traces of a violent struggle within the cramped confines of the unit. Just an eerie, suffocating vacuum where a young woman had been pulled straight out of her ordinary life in the dead of night. When the first responding patrol units crossed the threshold of the apartment, they shined their flashlights across a living space that looked entirely untouched by the criminal underworld, an image of absolute domestic normalcy that made the underlying emptiness feel infinitely more sinister. The forensic technicians combed through the carpets, dusted the door frames for latent prints, and utilized high-intensity lights to search the linoleum for foreign fibers, but the heat of the Arizona summer and the constant tracking of student traffic through the building had reduced the physical evidence to meaningless noise. A neighboring tenant reported hearing a faint, muffled thud through the drywall around 2:45 a.m., followed by the distant, low rumble of an industrial truck engine idling in the service alley behind the complex, but the blinding dust storm rolling through the valley that midnight meant there were no eyewitnesses, no functional security footage, and no immediate directional lead for the fleeing vehicle. The detectives were left standing at the edge of an invisible cliff, staring down into a canyon of dead ends while a frantic family began plastering the telephone poles of Maricopa County with flyers that would rot under the sun for decades. As the weeks bled into months, the crushing momentum of the investigation began to slow down under the harsh reality of an overstretched precinct dealing with a historic spike in narcotics-related violent crime across the valley. Chloe's family refused to let the city forget, organizing massive weekend search parties that combed the rugged, cactus-strewn terrain of the desert perimeters, tracking through dry riverbeds and abandoned mine shafts in a desperate, heartbreaking bid to locate a single piece of clothing or a discarded personal effect. But the desert does not give up its secrets easily. The wind shifted the sand, the summer rains washed away the tire tracks, and the digital footprint of Chloe Mercer simply ceased to exist after the midnight hour of August 11th, leaving investigators with nothing but an empty whiteboard and a mounting sense of professional failure. The file was eventually taped shut, stamped with a clinical, frustrating classification of an unresolved cold case, and slid into a metal cabinet in the basement of the Homicide Division, where the silence would remain unbroken for exactly 25 years. The breakthrough that would shatter this quarter-century stalemate did not arrive through a sudden match in the National DNA Database or the dramatic deathbed confession of a guilt-ridden suspect, but through the routine, administrative operations of a municipal code enforcement team clearing out an abandoned commercial storage facility slated for demolition near the interstate. Inside Unit 104, a space that had been legally locked since the winter of 2002 under a corporate name that had long since gone bankrupt, workers cleared away stacks of rusted industrial refrigeration parts, oil-stained tarps, and heavy mechanical tools. Hidden behind a false wooden panel at the very back of the concrete locker sat a heavy, fireproof document safe that required a hydraulic saw to snap open, releasing an odor of stale dust, calcified oil, and dry rot. Inside the safe, wrapped in protective layers of heavy-duty industrial plastic, lay the missing personal effects of Chloe Mercer, her missing university ID badge, a collection of gold jewelry her mother had described to detectives in 2001, and a small, hand-locked leather diary whose pages held the blueprint of a nightmare. The forensic laboratory became an elite command post as senior handwriting experts and digital imaging specialists worked under controlled lighting to carefully separate the brittle, water-damaged pages of the diary, recognizing that they were looking at a voice speaking directly from the center of a historical atrocity. The entries, written in a precise, looping script that grew increasingly hurried and erratic in the final weeks of July 2001, detailed an intense, terrifying pattern of stalking that Chloe had kept hidden from her family out of fear of escalation. The text described a shadow in the courtyard, an individual who possessed duplicate maintenance keys to the building, someone who left small, disturbing markers inside her apartment, a window lock left unlatched, a glass moved on the counter, the faint smell of industrial degreaser in her bathroom after she returned from her evening classes. The final entry, dated August 11, 2001, at 11:34 p.m., was a bone-chilling confirmation of the killer's identity, ending with the line, "He's outside the door again, using the master key. I can hear the lock turning." The focus of the homicide squad swung violently toward the names of the property management staff who had operated the university complex during that specific window of 2001, utilizing the names recorded in the diary to cross-reference historical employment records that had been preserved in corporate archives. The trail led directly to a 64-year-old retired HVAC technician named Raymond Vance, a man who had spent the last 2 decades living an impeccable, entirely unremarkable life as a family man and community volunteer in the quiet northern suburbs of Phoenix. When detectives converged on his residence with a high-priority arrest warrant, they found an elderly man who looked like an average grandfather, someone who had built an armor of suburban normalcy so perfect that his neighbors openly protested his arrest to the media. But as the forensic search teams moved past his manicured lawn and into his locked detached workshop, the physical reality of the 2001 diary entries began to manifest in the concrete below, revealing a hidden subterranean crawlspace where the final, gruesome verification of Chloe's fate was recovered from the dark. The forensic excavation of Vance's workshop lasted for 4 continuous days, transforming the quiet residential street into an active, high-intensity crime scene flooded with mobile command units, white biohazard tents, and teams of anthropologists meticulously sifting through the earth beneath the floorboards. The ground-penetrating radar shined a light on several deep structural anomalies near the foundation of the workshop's hydraulic press, prompting a manual dig that yielded a large, industrial-grade storage container packed with lime and industrial solvents to accelerate decomposition and suppress odor. Inside the container lay the skeletal remains of Chloe Mercer, her skull showing a catastrophic radiating fracture at the temple delivered with a heavy, blunt mechanical tool, the exact type of vintage wrench that technicians found sitting on Vance's active workbench above her grave. The forensic evidence was an unassailable mountain of horror. The killer had kept her body buried directly beneath his feet for 25 years while he worked on classic cars and hosted neighborhood block parties just inches from her resting place. The legal and psychological fallout across the city of Phoenix was immediate and devastating, shattering the illusion of suburban safety and leaving the valley paralyzed by the realization of the absolute transparency of evil. The media cycle was relentless, with true crime broadcasts and news anchors looping the image of the quiet old man in handcuffs against the backdrop of his pristine suburban home, juxtaposing the face of the helpful neighbor against the chilling words written in the victim's diary 25 years prior. For Chloe's aging mother, the discovery brought a brutal, heartbreaking end to a lifetime of torturous uncertainty, replacing the agonizing mystery of her daughter's disappearance with the stark, grim reality of the storage locker files and the workshop floor. The trial became an intense, highly charged arena of public grief, as prosecutors laid out the diary entries page by page, forcing the jury to listen to the victim's own voice describe the slow, calculated approach of the predator who sat silently at the defense table. The conviction of Raymond Vance to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole provided a clinical, administrative resolution for the Maricopa County justice system, but it could not wash away the lingering, corrosive sense of vulnerability that had settled into the bones of the community. People looked at their own apartment complexes, their own quiet suburban streets, and the service workers who held keys to their private lives with a new, deeply cynical eye, realizing that the mask of ordinary reliability is the most effective camouflage a monster can wear. The house at the center of the investigation was eventually demolished by the city, its foundation torn out and the earth filled with clean soil, but the empty space remained a permanent scar on the block, an open wound that reminded every passerby of the 25 years a young woman spent waiting in the dark below the concrete. The echoes of the Phoenix 2001 cold case continue to vibrate through the valley, a dark, permanent reminder that time does not wash away guilt and that the records we leave behind can eventually rise up to destroy the most meticulously constructed lies. Raymond Vance vanished into the maximum security infrastructure of the state penitentiary, his name stripped of its suburban artifice and reduced to an inmate number, destined to die in a concrete cell while the world he deceived forgets his existence. Yet, as the sun sets over the desert horizon, casting long, familiar shadows across the roads Chloe Mercer once walked, the city holds its breath, permanently changed by the knowledge that the truth is a patient, gravitational force, and that sometimes the only witness powerful enough to break a 25-year silence is the victim herself, speaking through the brittle pages of a forgotten diary left behind in the dark. The narrative of this 2001 atrocity did not dissolve with the falling of the judge's gavel. It permanently altered the operational architecture of the Phoenix Police Department's cold case division, turning the specific, data-driven techniques used to recover Chloe's diary into a mandatory protocol for all legacy investigations across the state. Investigators were forced to accept that the answers to their most frustrating mysteries are often sitting within the ignored, uncatalogued spaces of the city, locked inside corporate storage units, buried beneath the records of bankrupt property firms, or hidden in plain sight within the personal property of individuals who had been cleared by the rudimentary screening methods of the early 2000s. The file was officially closed, its contents moved to the digital archives, but the memory of the investigation remained alive as a cautionary study for every new recruit moving through the academy, a warning that justice is a long, winding, and often cruel process that demands an unyielding commitment to the preservation of the historical record. For the students who occupy the university apartments today, the story of Chloe Mercer has transitioned from a contemporary tragedy into a foundational piece of campus folklore, a ghost story whispered in the laundry rooms and courtyards after the desert sun goes down. They look at the locks on their doors, the security cameras hovering above the alleyways, and the shifting shadows of the palm trees with a heightened sense of caution, recognizing that the modern safety infrastructure they enjoy was built on the wreckage of a life that was stolen because those tools did not exist. The memory of the 19-year-old biology major who recorded her own stalking with the precision of a scientist remains embedded in the collective consciousness of the campus, a symbol of resilience that refuses to be erased by the passage of time or the indifference of a changing city. As the second summer after the trial approaches, bringing another wave of blinding heat and monsoon storms to the valley, the Jenkins family continues the quiet, private work of processing a grief that was put on hold for a generation. They have established a scholarship in Chloe's name at the university, an active, living monument that funds the education of young women pursuing careers in the forensic sciences, ensuring that her ambition and her intellect continue to influence the world she was so violently taken from. They have learned to live with the reality of the workshop floor, replacing the torturous mystery of their past with a somber, unyielding commitment to her memory, a peace that was earned through the sheer, stubborn endurance of a system that refused to let her name fade into the static of the past. The final chapter of this long, arduous journey leaves the city of Atlanta and the Valley of Phoenix linked by a common thread of historical reckoning, a shared understanding that the boundary between the domestic and the depraved is far thinner than our suburban dreams allow us to believe. The stories of Sarah Jenkins and Chloe Mercer serve as parallel testaments to the fact that secrets, no matter how deeply buried or how expertly camouflaged, eventually succumb to the slow, inevitable pressure of the light. The skyscrapers will continue to climb, the demographic shifts will continue to redefine the landscape, and the daily life of the metropolis will expand at a pace that leaves little room for the shadows of the past. But beneath the glass and steel, the bedrock of the city will always hold the record of the truth, written in the unshakable, permanent ink of the witnesses who refused to stay silent in the dark. The courtroom where Raymond Vance heard his sentence read has returned to its quiet, bureaucratic routine, the benches occupied by new juries dealing with new crimes, the digital presentation screens displaying new graphics for cases that will define the safety of the valley in the decades to come. The detectives who carried the folders of the 2001 investigation have retired, their badges passed down to a new generation of law enforcement professionals who operate within a world completely transformed by the digital integration of the modern era. But the story of the small leather journal recovered from Unit 104 remains as a permanent, haunting reminder of the duty the state owes to those who have been forgotten, a declaration that the work of justice is a continuous, iterative process that does not stop until the final word has been recorded, the final has been connected, and the ghost has finally been laid to rest. The empty space where the northern suburb workshop once stood has been covered in gravel and native desert plants, a sparse, clean landscaping design that offers no texture for the eye to catch on, no physical reference point for the horror that occurred 5 feet below the surface. The neighbors who lived through the excavation have slowly begun to move away, selling their properties to buyers who have no memory of the white tents or the flashing blue lights that paralyzed their block for 4 days in the spring of 2026. The neighborhood is discovering how to be normal again, how to walk down the sidewalks without looking at the hedges with suspicion, how to live without the immediate, crushing weight of the Vance deception coloring their understanding of their friends and their community. Yet, in the deep, silent hours of the Arizona night, when the desert wind howls through the power lines and the dust scratches against the window panes of the university apartments, the city remembers the girl who wrote her own indictment in the dark. Her voice, preserved through the fortuitous preservation of a fireproof safe, remains as a persistent, vibrating force within the history of the valley, a reminder that the truth is not something that can be neutralized by lime or hidden behind a false panel in a storage locker. It is a living, breathing component of the human record, a gravitational force that will always, eventually, drag the monster out of his suburban camouflage and force him to look at the wreckage he left behind on a rainy night 25 years ago. The long, winding road that began with an unmade bed in August of 2001 has finally reached its permanent terminus, and in the clarity of the desert light, there are no more files to digitize, no more core samples to drill, and no more questions to ask. There is only the enduring, unshakable reality of a truth that has finally, and for all time, come home to the city of Phoenix. The files have been cataloged, the exhibits have been archived, and the name Chloe Mercer has been written into the permanent, indelible record of the city's survivors, a beacon of clarity that will stand long after the suburban subdivisions have turned back into the desert sand from which they were built. The manhunt is over, the cold case is solved, and the shadow that stretched across the valley for a generation has finally, mercifully, receded into the light of a new day. The extraction of the water-damaged journal from the fireproof safe in Unit 104 was merely the opening movement in a complex, multi-agency operation that would systematically dismantle the 25-year-old illusion of Raymond Vance's innocence. For a quarter of a century, Vance had lived under the comforting assumption that his past had been successfully dissolved by the desert heat, locked away in an anonymous steel locker under a dead corporate entity. But as the senior homicide detectives from the Maricopa County Cold Case Unit began lay out the contents of that safe on the sterile, stainless steel tables of the Forensic Division, the true density of his crimes began to crystallize. This was not a collection of forgotten household overflow. It was a highly organized, calculated archive of a lifetime spent observing, tracking, and ultimately destroying human life. Every item within that container, from the tarnished silver rings to the precise, blocky handwritten notations, served as a permanent, physical indictment that bridged the immense technological chasm between the analog chaos of 2001 and the high-definition tracking systems of 2026. The forensic examination of Chloe Mercer's diary required a level of microscopic precision that transformed the laboratory into an elite command post, where the survival of the evidence depended entirely on the suppression of environmental variables. The leather binding had been heavily warped by decades of exposure to fluctuating desert temperatures and localized humidity, causing the fibers to constrict around the central binding cords like a vice. Technicians utilizing specialized humidification chambers worked for 48 continuous hours to slowly restore elasticity to the organic materials, preventing the brittle cellulose of the pages from shattering under the manual manipulation of the text experts. Under high-intensity ultraviolet and infrared light sweeps, the faded blue ink began to flare with a brilliant, digital clarity, revealing that Chloe's initial entries from June 2001 were characterized by a deep, unsettling intuition that her private space was being systematically infiltrated by an invisible entity. He was in the apartment again today. A restored entry from June 14, 2001, read, the script vibrating with a quiet, isolated terror that made the veteran detectives in the room visibly tighten their jaws. The small blue glass on the bathroom counter was moved to the left side of the sink. I always leave it on the right. The lock on the patio slider was unlatched from the inside, but the screen was still closed. I know I locked it before I left for the library. Someone is coming inside while I am at work, but they aren't taking anything. They are just touching my things, leaving the faint smell of motor oil and metallic solvent in the air. I called the rental office, but they told me no maintenance requests had been logged for my building this week. They think I am misplacing my things because of the stress of finals. This clinical, historical documentation of her own stalking proved that Vance had been using his unrestricted access as an HVAC technician to conduct a slow, psychological destabilization of his target long before he executed the final abduction. As the text progressed deeper into the blistering heat of July 2001, the diary entries chronicled a calculated escalation of proximity that illustrated the predatory mechanics Vance utilized to isolate his victim. Chloe detailed finding small, deliberate markers left on her bed, a folded coin, a specific type of industrial screw, a single drop of dark hydraulic fluid on her white pillowcase, each item serving as a silent, sadistic declaration of his absolute control over her environment. The local precinct's original 2001 investigation had completely overlooked these psychological variables, treating her family's initial reports of a suspected stalker as circumstantial noise in a city that was currently logging over 300 violent property crimes a week. The detectives had looked for broken glass, forced entry, and bloodstains, completely blind to the fact that the most dangerous entry point into Chloe's life was the duplicate brass master key sitting in the pocket of the quiet, helpful maintenance man who offered to check her air conditioning unit every Tuesday afternoon. The spatial temporal analysis of the storage facility logs soon revealed that Unit 104 had been leased on August 14, 2001, exactly 48 hours after Chloe Mercer vanished from her locked apartment. The name on the original paper lease was a defunct ventilation contracting firm that Vance had operated as a side business during the late 90s, an entity that had been dissolved by the state of Arizona in 2003 due to tax delinquency. By registering the locker under a corporate umbrella rather than his personal social security number, Vance had successfully insulated the physical repository of his trophies from the rudimentary digital searches available to law enforcement during the early years of the missing person investigation. The locker had sat undisturbed through economic recessions, corporate liquidations, and shifting municipal boundaries, a silent capsule of violence that remained completely invisible to the system until the city's code enforcement team marked the entire commercial complex for structural demolition in 2026. While the forensic analysts continued their deconstruction of the diary, a tactical surveillance team was deployed to the quiet suburban enclave of North Phoenix, where Raymond Vance had spent the last 2 decades constructing a pristine, unassailable fortress of domestic normalcy. The neighborhood was a master-planned development characterized by wide, immaculate cul-de-sacs, desert landscaping, and rows of single-story stucco homes that all looked identical under the blinding Arizona sun. Vance was viewed by his neighbors as the absolute bedrock of the local community, a reclusive but deeply reliable grandfather who spent his retirement volunteering at the municipal library, repairing vintage lawnmowers for the elderly residents, and maintaining a meticulously manicured property that never violated a single homeowners association regulation. The cognitive dissonance within the neighborhood was immediate and volatile when the unmarked tactical SUVs blocked the entrances to the cul-de-sac and teams of heavily armed officers in body armor surrounded the property. The residents stood on their porches in a state of absolute, defensive disbelief. The execution of the high-priority arrest warrant was a cold, clinical operation that allowed Vance no opportunity to leverage the complex network of domestic camouflages he had maintained for 25 years. He was confronted in his driveway as he returned from a routine morning run to the local grocery store, his hands immediately secured in steel cuffs before he could even drop the plastic bags of produce onto the hot asphalt. His demeanor during the initial arrest was described by the processing officers as terrifyingly serene. His pulse remained steady, his voice low and polite, his pale blue eyes entirely devoid of the panic or the defensive outrage that typically characterizes an innocent man caught in a structural net. He looked like an ordinary, frail elderly citizen being subjected to a bizarre bureaucratic error, his soft-spoken responses to the reading of his constitutional rights delivered with the detached politeness of a retired utility worker dealing with an administrative dispute. Back at the Maricopa County Homicide Precinct, the interrogation of Raymond Vance turned into a psychological stalemate that tested the absolute limits of the cold case detective's patience. Vance sat in the low-backed metal chair beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the interview room, his hands folded neatly on the table, his posture entirely relaxed as the lead investigators slid the high-resolution photographs of Chloe Mercer's recovered jewelry and ID badge across the table. He did not deny his connection to the storage facility, nor did he attempt to fabricate an alibi for the corporate lease from August 2001. Instead, he engaged in a systematic, polite stonewalling that relied heavily on the natural erosion of his own memory over a 25-year span. "I ran a lot of contracting businesses back then, gentlemen," he said, his voice a dry, rhythmic rasp that carried no hint of emotional fluctuation. "We rented dozens of storage lockers across the valley to hold surplus compressors, refrigerant tanks, and old tools. If someone else used that unit, or if those items were placed there by a subcontractor, I simply don't have the memory files left to help you." 25 years is a lifetime in the desert. But while Vance maintained his defensive wall of selective cognitive decay inside the interrogation room, the forensic execution of the search warrant at his suburban residence was uncovering a physical, undeniable record of murder that the desert clay had refused to completely dissolve. The focus of the search quickly shifted away from the interior of the stucco house, which was a model of ordinary, sterile domestic life, and settled entirely on a detached, triple-car workshop at the rear of the property where Vance had spent thousands of hours working alone after dark. The workshop was a temple to mechanical organization. Rows of vintage wrenches, hydraulic jacks, and diagnostic equipment were arranged across heavy steel workbenches with a clinical, military precision that mirrored the handwriting found within the 2001 ledger. The air inside smelled strongly of motor oil, spent solvents, and high-grade industrial degreaser, the exact sensory profile Chloe Mercer had recorded in her diary 25 years earlier when she realized her apartment had been breached. A specialized team of forensic geologists and structural engineers utilized advanced ground-penetrating radar systems to scan every square inch of the concrete slab floor, looking for density anomalies, modern patches, or structural variances that indicated the underlying earth had been disturbed after the original construction of the workshop in 2002. The radar monitor soon displayed a distinct, rectangular distortion located directly beneath the heavy, fixed foundation of a 4-ton hydraulic shop press near the back wall of the structure. The data showed that a 5-by-8-foot section of the reinforced concrete had been meticulously cut out, excavated to a depth of 6 feet, and then refilled with a non-standard mixture of high-density aggregate and modern epoxy sealant that had been artificially aged with industrial stains to match the surrounding floor. The lead detective ordered the immediate deployment of heavy diamond-tipped concrete saws, initiating a high-intensity excavation that would finally pull the final secret of the Phoenix 2001 cold case out of the dark. The manual digging through the compacted desert clay beneath the concrete slab was a brutal, grueling process that required the technicians to work in shifts within the cramped, suffocating confines of the trench, their respirators filtering out the thick, white dust of old construction material and dry soil. At a depth of exactly 5.5 feet, the teeth of their hand trowels struck the rigid, corrugated surface of a heavy-duty, industrial polyethylene chemical drum, its top lid secured by an iron locking ring that had been reinforced with layers of weathered duct tape and heavy vulcanized rubber gaskets. The impact of the tool cracked the brittle seal, releasing a concentrated, toxic pocket of gas that immediately saturated the white forensic tent, a stench that combined the sharp, acrid bite of commercial HVAC solvents with the unmistakable, heavy aroma of long-term human decomposition. Inside the sterile environment of the Central County Morgue, the medical examiner and a team of forensic anthropologists spent 36 continuous hours extracting the contents of the polyethylene drum, working with the delicate reverence required to preserve a skeleton that had spent a quarter of a century under pressure. The body had been completely packed with industrial-grade calcium oxide, commonly known as quicklime, a chemical compound Vance had sourced from his commercial refrigeration inventory to accelerate the destruction of soft tissue and prevent the generation of putrefying gases that could fracture the container or alert his family with a distinct odor. The lime had done its work with terrifying efficiency, dissolving the organic fabrics and tissues until only a clean, mottled brown skeletal frame remained. But the chemical reaction had also inadvertently preserved the structural integrity of the bones, locking the physical record of the final violence into the calcium itself. The forensic anthropologists reassembled the skeleton on a large stainless steel examination table, using high-resolution digital X-rays and laser scanning systems to analyze the bone surfaces for signs of traumatic injury or tool marks. The definitive cause of death was located on the left temporal bone of the skull, a massive, 3-inch depressed fracture that had shattered the bone inward with immense velocity, sending a series of radiating fissures upward toward the crown of the head and downward into the base of the cranium. The dimensions and the internal curvature of the crushing injury perfectly matched the striking face of a 16-inch vintage heavy-duty mechanical wrench that technicians had recovered from Vance's active tool rack directly above the excavation site. There were no defensive fractures on her forearms or hands, indicating with absolute clarity that Chloe Mercer had been completely blindsided, struck down from behind in the dark before she ever had an opportunity to turn and confront the face of her collector. The momentum of the forensic discovery broke the back of the defense's legal strategy long before the case could ever reach the preliminary hearings of the Maricopa County Superior Court. The prosecution team organized the evidence into an unassailable, historical timeline that linked the 2001 diary entries, the corporate storage unit lease, the recovered jewelry, and the skeletal remains beneath the workshop floor into a single, devastating narrative of premeditated predation. The public response across the valley was a mixture of intense, volatile outrage and a profound sense of cultural vertigo, the realization that a man could execute a college student, bury her beneath his workspace, and then spend 25 years hosting neighborhood barbecues and volunteering at the local library shattered the illusion of safety that defined the modern Phoenix suburbs. The trial would not be a deliberation of identity, but an intensive public accounting of a lifetime spent living behind a mask of ordinary reliability, a mask that had finally and permanently been ripped away by the voice of the victim herself speaking from the brittle pages of a forgotten diary. The presentation of the physical remains and the structural layout of Raymond Vance's backyard workshop converted the legal proceedings into an unyielding, high-density demonstration of forensic certainty, leaving the defense team with no viable path toward a traditional acquittal. The Maricopa County Superior Court became a theater of intense, heavy historical reckoning as the prosecution team meticulously laid out the contents of the fireproof safe from Unit 104 alongside the core samples extracted from the concrete floor of the North Phoenix garage. The courtroom was packed to capacity every morning with members of the public, university students, and veteran investigators who had watched the original 2001 missing persons file turn into a legendary urban ghost story. They sat in absolute, suffocating silence as the digital presentation screens displayed the high-resolution, three-dimensional scans of the temporal fracture, forcing the room to look directly at the precise geometry of a 25-year-old act of violence. The prosecution's operational strategy for this phase of the trial was designed to strip away the last remaining elements of Vance's suburban credibility by focusing strictly on the mechanics of his spatial control. They called to the stand a sequence of property management executives who had overseen the university housing complex in 2001, forcing them to authenticate the old, paper-based key control logs that had been pulled from the corporate archives. The logs demonstrated that Raymond Vance had signed out the brass master key for Chloe Mercer's building on 14 separate occasions during the 2 months leading up to her disappearance, always under the administrative pretense of checking the emergency ventilation filters or balancing the industrial cooling systems on the roof. By placing his physical authorization signatures directly next to the dates Chloe had recorded the covert entries in her diary, the legal team constructed an airtight, chronological cage that Vance could not escape with his claims of selective cognitive decay. When Marcus Thorne, the senior cold case analyst who had directed the data integration project, took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom reached a level of clinical, high-stakes tension. Thorne did not use the emotional or sensational language common to true crime media. He spoke with the bloodless precision of a data engineer, explaining how the integration of modern municipal databases had allowed his unit to trace the historical lineage of the corporate entity used to lease storage Unit 104. He demonstrated to the jury that the signatures on the 2001 storage lease, the 2002 workshop construction permits, and the 2026 driver's license registration were all executed by the same hand, utilizing identical stroke patterns and a highly specific mechanical slant in the block lettering. The defense's attempt to introduce the theory of an unknown subcontractor or a case of identity theft was systematically dismantled under the weight of Thorne's digital overlays, which proved with mathematical certainty that Raymond Vance was the sole operator of every space where Chloe Mercer's memory had been confined. The testimony of the forensic geologist who analyzed the soil layers beneath the workshop floor added another layer of unassailable physical proof to the state's case. The expert explained to the jury that the compacted desert clay surrounding the polyethylene chemical drum contained high concentrations of localized calcification and trace tracking minerals that were entirely unique to the excavation lot where the university apartments had stood in 2001. This meant that Vance had not only killed Chloe inside his workspace or transported her remains in the drum, he had carried a significant amount of the physical soil from the original abduction site on his boots and tools, embedding it permanently into the subfloor of his new suburban workshop when he poured the aggregate mix in 2002. The earth itself had acted as a geographical fingerprint, trapping the microscopic remnants of the 2001 crime scene beneath 4 inches of reinforced concrete and keeping it pristine for a quarter of a century until the diamond-tipped saws cut it free. For the Mercer family, the daily exposure to these granular, forensic reconstructions was an exercise in extreme, heroic endurance that left the entire gallery in a state of emotional awe. Chloe's mother sat in the front row of the gallery, her eyes locked onto the stainless steel evidence trays containing the small gold rings and the university ID badge that had been pulled from the fireproof safe, her hands trembling but her posture unyielding. She had spent 25 years living with the torturous, open-ended mystery of an unmade bed and an empty apartment, and while the reality of the workshop floor was a horizontal nightmare that defied description, it was at least a tangible reality that could be fought with the mechanics of the law. She refused to look away from the screens when the forensic anthropologists demonstrated the alignment of the vintage heavy-duty wrench with the fracture patterns on her daughter's skull, choosing to bear witness to the full, unvarnished truth of what Chloe had recorded in her final diary entries. The defense team's cross-examination of the forensic experts was a clipped, purely procedural effort that focused heavily on the advanced age of the skeletal remains and the theoretical potential for chemical contamination due to the presence of the quicklime inside the drum. They argued that because the soft tissues had been completely dissolved by the alkaline environment, it was legally impossible for the medical examiner to determine the exact timestamp of the fatal blow or to prove whether the skull fracture had occurred before or after the body was placed inside the container. It was a cold, pedantic attempt to introduce a sliver of reasonable doubt into the record, but the argument fell completely flat when the prosecution recalled the forensic pathologist to the stand. The specialist pointed out that the microscopic bruising patterns and the specific, inward beveling of the bone fibers could only have been produced by a high-velocity impact on living tissue with active blood pressure, completely neutralizing the defense's claim that the injury could have been an accidental, post-mortem consequence of the excavation process. The midpoint of the trial was marked by the formal reading of Chloe Mercer's final diary entries into the official record, a moment that transformed the victim from an abstract historical figure into the primary, driving witness of her own prosecution. The assistant district attorney read the text with a flat, neutral tone, allowing the simple, terrifying clarity of Chloe's own words to fill the silent chamber. The entry from August 10, 2001, written less than 36 hours before her disappearance, described a final, overt confrontation with the maintenance man in the courtyard of the complex, an interaction that revealed the true depth of the predator's possessive fixation. He stopped me by the mailboxes today, the looping script read, flaring brightly on the courtroom monitors. He asked me why I had installed a new secondary chain lock on my front door. He said it was a violation of the fire code and that he would have to come inside to remove it tomorrow. He was smiling, but his eyes were completely dead, and he kept tapping a long metal tool against his leg while he spoke to me. I felt sick to my stomach. I am going to pack my things and drive to my mother's house on Sunday morning as soon as my last lab report is submitted. I don't feel safe in this room anymore. The final entry, dated August 11, 2001, at 11:34 p.m., provided the definitive, chilling closure to the narrative of the disappearance, leaving the jury with an inescapable portrait of the crime's opening moments. The handwriting was noticeably fractured, the ink lines trailing off as if the writer were listening intently to a sound outside the frame of the paper. The power to the entire back wing of the building just went out. The final lines read, the text pressed so hard into the paper that it had punctured the underlying page. The AC unit stopped humming, and the courtyard lights are completely dark. I can't hear someone walking up the service stairs behind my kitchen wall. It's not the standard security patrol. The footsteps are heavy, slow, and deliberate. Now there is a key sliding into my deadbolt. It's the master key. The chain lock is the only thing holding the door. Oh God, he's turning the knob. The text ended there, a raw, unfinished cliff that hung over the courtroom like a guillotine. The closing arguments for the state were delivered not as an appeal to the emotions of the jury, but as a ruthless, mathematical summation of the physical evidence. The prosecutor stood before the jury box, his hands gesturing to the array of evidence cones, maps, and core samples that occupied the center of the room. He reminded the jurors that Raymond Vance had built an entire life, a family, and a reputation on top of a 6-foot trench of industrial lime, relying on the indifference of a changing city and the natural erosion of time to wash away the memory of his violence. He thought the concrete would hold the secret forever, the prosecutor said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding resonance that echoed against the wood paneling of the court. He thought that by moving 3 miles away, changing his business name, and volunteering at the local library, he could erase the girl in the courtyard. But he forgot that the truth doesn't rot. He forgot that Chloe Mercer wrote his name into the history of the city before he ever turned that key, and today, that voice is demanding that the mask be taken off for good. The jury's deliberation was remarkably brief, lasting less than 3 hours, a clinical, efficient confirmation that the mountain of forensic and documentary evidence left absolutely no room for debate or compromise within the modern justice system. When the court reconvened on a hot Friday afternoon, the foreman stood to read the verdict with an unwavering clarity that felt like a physical hammer hitting the defense table. On the charge of first-degree premeditated murder, we find the defendant, Raymond Vance, guilty. The reaction from the gallery was a collective, ragged sigh of absolute release, the sound of a 25-year-old cloud of suspicion and terror finally evaporating under the clean, harsh light of a legal certainty. Vance remained entirely motionless as the words were spoken, his face maintaining the same detached, grandfatherly serenity that had protected him through 2 decades of suburban camouflage, his eyes fixed blankly on the empty space between the monitors as the bailiffs stepped forward to secure his wrists in heavy steel transit irons. The sentencing phase, delivered 2 days later by the presiding judge, was an absolute, unmitigated finality that ensured Raymond Vance would spend the remaining fragments of his life within the highest security tiers of the state correctional system. The judge did not indulge in performative lecturing or grandstanding. She read the consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole with the flat, administrative weight of a system that was simply correcting an old error in its ledger. The doors of the Maricopa County Courthouse swung open immediately after the adjournment, allowing the crowds of reporters, students, and citizens to pour out into the blinding, triple-digit heat of the Phoenix afternoon, their voices blending with the roar of the traffic as the news feeds carried the confirmation of the verdict to millions of screens across the valley. The Phoenix 2001 cold case was no longer an unresolved folder in a dark basement. It was a completed chapter, a history written in the unshakable, permanent ink of a victim who had refused to stay silent in the dark. The transformation of the verdict into a permanent, institutional reality did not bring an immediate sense of celebratory relief to the Maricopa County Cold Case Unit. Instead, it initiated a grueling, retrospective audit of the entire municipal justice apparatus. As Raymond Vance was led from the courtroom in heavy transit irons, his grandfatherly mask permanently shattered under the weight of consecutive life sentences, detectives turned their attention back to the massive trail of administrative documentation he had left behind over a 25-year span. The case was legally resolved. The family had been provided with the brutal, tangible reality of Chloe Mercer's resting place, but the system itself was forced to look into the mirror and confront a terrifying vulnerability. For a quarter of a century, a serial predator had managed to operate a commercial HVAC enterprise, pass standard corporate background checks, sit on municipal volunteer boards, and navigate the expanding suburban grid of Phoenix without a single red flag flaring in the state database. Inside the data center of the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, the original, dusty cardboard boxes of the 2001 missing persons file were finally cataloged, stamped with a digital archive marker, and transferred to the permanent historical repository. But the processing of case number 01-11942 did not mark the end of the technical labor. It served as the baseline dataset for a complete overhaul of how legacy investigations were conducted across the Southwest. The Mercer Doctrine, a legislative package rapidly introduced in the state Senate following the trial's conclusion, mandated that any open missing persons file older than a decade must undergo a mandatory, automated audit utilizing modern spatial temporal profiling software. The software was designed to do exactly what Marcus Thorne had executed manually: cross-reference old, paper-based key control logs, defunct corporate property leases, and historical utility cutoffs against the known addresses of unresolved victims, transforming the passive, forgotten archives of the late 20th century into a dynamic, predatory net designed to trap legacy killers before their own cognitive decline insulated them from punishment. The physical deconstruction of Raymond Vance's suburban workshop in North Phoenix began in the early weeks of autumn, a clinical operation managed by a municipal structural demolition crew under the direct supervision of the county's Environmental Safety Unit. The family that had lived next door to house number 1142 for 2 decades watched from behind heavy chain-link barriers as the hydraulic excavators tore through the stucco walls, collapsed the roof lines, and began the arduous process of breaking up the reinforced concrete slab floor. The 4-ton hydraulic shop press, beneath which the polyethylene chemical drum had spent 25 years buried in the desert clay, was lifted out by a heavy crane, its rusted metal frame loaded onto a flatbed truck bound for a commercial recycling yard downtown. Technicians using heavy diamond-tipped jackhammers systematically pulverized the aggregate Mix Vance had poured in 2002, ensuring that every ounce of the artificial aggregate was removed and that the underlying earth was thoroughly cleared of any chemical or organic residues left by the quicklime bath. For the students and faculty at the University Apartment Complex, where Chloe Mercer had once lived and studied, the conclusion of the trial marked the final transition of her story from an active, lingering anxiety into a foundational piece of campus history. The narrow service alleyway behind the back wing of the building, the dark corridor where Vance had staged his industrial service truck beneath the blinding dust storm of August 12, 2001, was completely remodeled, its old asphalt torn out and replaced with a well-lit, open-air pedestrian plaza equipped with modern, high-definition security arrays and automated access control points. The memory of the 19-year-old biology major who had recorded her own stalking with the cold, analytical precision of a lab scientist remained embedded in the collective consciousness of the campus, a permanent warning about the fragility of domestic security and an enduring monument to the power of the human record to survive the most calculated efforts of concealment. Toby Jenkins, who had spent his entire adult life navigating the complex, multi-layered trauma of his cousin's disappearance, found himself experiencing a strange, heavy stillness in the weeks following the sentencing. He spent his weekends sitting in the small, sun-bleached courtyard of his grandmother's brick bungalow on the western side of the valley, looking at the empty boxes of historical records that had previously dominated his living space. He had spent years analyzing the fragments of a mystery, tracking down retired property managers, searching through bankrupt corporate filings, and imagining his cousin's face on every unidentified body report across the western states. Now that the mystery had been replaced by a concrete, horizontal reality of a workshop floor and a vintage mechanic's wrench, he felt a profound, absolute exhaustion that seemed to age him by a decade in a matter of days. He realized that the completion of the record had not given him back his youth, nor had it reversed the slow, corrosive entropy that the 35-year silence had executed on his family. It had simply given him the right to finally stop looking backward into the sand. His grandmother, Clara, did not survive to see the first winter after the trial's conclusion, her fragile physical frame finally succumbing to a terminal respiratory condition that had been severely accelerated by the high adrenaline stress of the excavation months. She passed away quietly in her sleep on a crisp November morning, her face carrying a smooth, deeply settled peace that had been entirely absent from her features since the summer of 2001. Her funeral was held at the small, non-denominational chapel near the university campus, a quiet, solemn service attended by a small group of family members, old neighbors from the subdivision, and the cold case detectives who had carried the manila folders of the investigation across the finish line. She was interred directly adjacent to Chloe's marked grave beneath the massive cemetery oak tree on the perimeter of the valley, a final, physical reconciliation that brought the two generations together under a single, permanent marker of stone, completely out of the reach of the predator's memory or the system's bureaucratic negligence. The true crime media apparatus, which had briefly turned the steps of the Maricopa County Courthouse into an active, high-intensity content market during the presentation of the diary entries, had long since packed away its satellite dishes and directional microphones, shifting its collective focus to newer, more volatile atrocities in other cities. The case of Chloe Mercer had migrated entirely out of the realm of sensational public consumption and into the permanent, analytical framework of forensic science institutes and university law libraries, cited frequently in research papers as the classic example of the delayed forensic recovery. Academic studies focused extensively on the preservation dynamics of the polyethylene drum, analyzing how the dry, high-alkaline environment created by the quicklime had inadvertently protected the structural integrity of the bone marrow, allowing modern sequencing units to extract a flawless DNA profile 25 years after the soft tissues had been completely liquefied by the chemical reaction. Raymond Vance existed now only as an alphanumeric entry in the central tracking system of the Arizona Department of Corrections, his physical identity completely stripped of its suburban artifice and reduced to the uniform, anonymous routine of a maximum security medical wing near the Mexican border. He spent his days sitting in a mobile restraint chair within a windowless concrete cell, his pale blue eyes entirely vacant as his remaining neural pathways continued to succumb to the slow, indifferent progression of vascular dementia. He did not communicate with the correctional staff, did not request access to the facility's yard, and did not acknowledge the occasional legal updates delivered by his court-appointed appellate counsel. The silence he had used as a weapon against the Mercer family for a quarter of a century had turned inward, locking him into a featureless, cognitive void where the memory of the university apartment complex the storage unit safe, and the girl in the courtyard had been entirely erased by the destruction of his own brain tissue. As the second summer after the trial began to settle over the Phoenix Basin, bringing with it a familiar wave of blinding triple-digit heat and violent, late-afternoon monsoon storms, the ultimate historical meaning of the 2001 cold case became quietly, unforgettably clear to those who still walked the streets of the valley. The story had never been about the mechanical precision of the hydraulic shop press or the sudden, accidental convenience of a code enforcement inspection at an abandoned storage facility. It was an epic, universal meditation on the absolute, unyielding authority of the human record. It served as an unshakable proof that every act of premeditated violence leaves an indelible, permanent print on the history of the metropolis, a faint but persistent trail that cannot be fully neutralized by industrial lime, covered by reinforced concrete, or hidden behind the mask of an exemplary retirement. The city of Phoenix had survived its longest, deepest confrontation with its own buried secrets, turning a legendary urban ghost story into an active, living monument to the duty of remembrance, leaving behind an empty, sunlit lot in the suburbs, a family resting in the peace of a marked grave, and a ground that had finally, completely, given up its dead to the light. The landscape of Phoenix in the late autumn of 2026 offered no visible markers of the tectonic legal shift that had occurred within the Maricopa County Superior Court, but beneath the shimmering, heat-scarred asphalt of the valley, an invisible grid of institutional accountability was hardening into place. At house number 1142 in the northern suburbs, where Raymond Vance had spent 20 years manicuring his hedges above a 6-foot grave of industrial lime, the earth was finally being allowed to breathe. The heavy machinery had departed, the forensic tents had been folded into the backs of county utility vans, and the tattered yellow strands of police tape had been swept into the municipal waste stream. The lot sat entirely open, a flat expanse of dark, freshly turned desert aggregate that looked completely unremarkable to the casual motorists navigating the suburban bypass, yet it remained a profound, geometric scar in the consciousness of the surrounding neighborhood. A physical reminder that the thin barrier between domestic tranquility and total depravity can hold its shape for exactly 25 years before collapsing into the light. Inside the administrative headquarters of the Arizona Department of Public Safety, the structural legacy of the Mercer case was transitioning from a chaotic, high-priority emergency response into a permanent, bloodless protocol. The Database Engineering Division had spent 6 months absorbing the algorithmic workflows Marcus Thorne had utilized to crack the Vance corporate shield, translating his manual cross-referencing techniques into an automated system known across the state as the Mercer Analytical Index. The framework was designed to operate continuously in the digital dark, running silent, high-volume audits through the uncatalogued, historical data pools of the late 20th century, matching old refrigeration certification records, forgotten commercial vehicle registries, and defunct property management alibis against the known, unresolved coordinates of missing person files from the analog era. It was a cold, mathematical realization that the system had finally stopped waiting for the accidental discovery of a buried container. It had learned to treat time not as an obstacle to justice, but as a data matrix that could be systematically mined until the truth was extracted. The psychological fallout within the cul-de-sac of the North Phoenix subdivision continued to execute a slow, corrosive wave of isolation that permanently altered the social dynamics of the neighborhood. The residents who had lived side by side with Raymond Vance for 2 decades, the people who had borrowed his mechanical tools, invited his grandchildren to their backyard pool parties, and stood on his porch defending his character during the opening hours of the police raid, found themselves trapped in an agonizing cycle of self-doubt. They spent their evenings reviewing their own memories, dissecting 20 years of ordinary, pleasant interactions with a man who had been fixing their broken air conditioning units, while a college student lay disintegrating beneath his active hydraulic shop press. The realization that absolute, calculated evil could wear the mask of a reliable, quiet retirement was a philosophical poison that corrupted their understanding of communal trust, transforming their ordinary suburban street into a landscape of potential horrors where every closed garage door was viewed with a cold, defensive suspicion. For Toby Jenkins, the absolute termination of the legal proceedings brought a profound, disorienting stasis that threatened to unhinge the fragile stability of his adult life. He had spent his entire developmental existence defined by the active momentum of the search, his personality constructed around the singular, unyielding purpose of finding out what had happened to his cousin after the lights went out in her university apartment in August of 2001. Now that the search had ended with a consecutive life sentence and a marked grave beneath the cemetery oak tree, the driving engine of his identity was gone, leaving behind an empty, silent space that no ordinary routine could satisfy. He found himself walking through the rooms of his grandmother's bungalow, looking at the blank patches of plaster where his maps and timelines had once been pinned, feeling a deep, physical exhaustion that seemed to separate him from the active, forward-moving world of his peers. He had won the long war against the silence of the desert, but he had arrived at the finish line entirely alone, his youth having been completely consumed by the grit and the dust of a 25-year archive. The university housing complex, which had stood for a quarter of a century as the geographic centerpiece of the valley's most enduring mystery, underwent a complete architectural excision designed to erase the historical memory of the Predator's entry point. The corporate management firm that had taken over the property in the wake of the trial initiated a multi-million-dollar structural renovation, tearing down the outdated exterior stairwells and sealing off the narrow service alleyways that Vance had exploited under the cover of the 2001 dust storm. The new plaza was constructed from polished, high-density concrete and open glass, designed to maximize visibility and eliminate the dark, isolated corners that modern security systems view as high-risk blind spots. The current students who occupied the units moved through the bright, neon-lit common spaces with the casual indifference of a generation that had no personal connection to the year 2001, completely unaware that the safety infrastructure they took for granted had been paid for with the life of a 19-year-old biology major who had recorded her own stalking in the pages of a water-damaged leather journal. Inside the high-security medical wing of the state correctional facility near the Mexican border, the man who had orchestrated that nightmare was experiencing his own total erasure from the human record. Raymond Vance's existence had been reduced to an administrative number on a plastic wristband, his physical autonomy entirely stripped away by the clinical, repetitive routines of the institutional staff. The vascular dementia that had protected him from the full, emotional reality of the courtroom interrogation continued its steady, indifferent destruction of his neural pathways, systematically wiping out the remaining fragments of his personal history and his awareness of the present day. He spent his days staring out the small, reinforced window of his concrete cell at the flat, heat-shrunk horizon of the desert, his long, grease-stained fingers moving rhythmically against his knees as if he were still turning a wrench in the dark workspace of his North Phoenix home. He was a prisoner of his own failing biology, completely insulated from the public outrage and the systemic changes that his crimes had detonated across the state, a hollow shell drifting toward a quiet, unpunished death in the absolute dark of an institutional void. The true crime broadcasters and digital sleuths who had turned the steps of the Maricopa County Courthouse into an active, high-intensity content market had completely abandoned the valley, their production trailers and high-powered satellite dishes long since deployed to newer, more volatile crime scenes in distant states. The story of Chloe Mercer had officially transitioned out of the volatile realm of public consumption and settled permanently into the sterile, analytical framework of forensic science institutes and university law libraries, cited in research papers as the classic reference case for legacy-linked data synergy and delayed osteological recovery. The focus of the academic discourse remained fixed on the unique preservation dynamics inside the polyethylene chemical drum, analyzing how the high-alkaline environment created by the quicklime had inadvertently prevented the environmental degradation of the bone marrow, allowing modern sequencing units to extract a perfect genetic profile 25 years after the soft tissues had been completely destroyed by the chemical reaction. As the late autumn sun began to drop behind the rugged, volcanic ridges of the mountains surrounding the Phoenix Basin, casting long, dramatic geometric shadows across the vast, interlocking network of service roads and suburban cul-de-sacs, the ultimate historical resolution of the 2001 cold case became quietly, unforgettably clear to those who had lived through its duration. The narrative had never been about the mechanical precision of a hydraulic shop press or the sudden, accidental convenience of a code enforcement inspection at an abandoned commercial storage facility. It was an epic, universal proof of the absolute, inescapable authority of the human record. It served as an unshakable declaration that every act of premeditated violence leaves an permanent, historical print on the world, a faint but persistent resonance that cannot be fully neutralized by industrial chemicals hidden beneath 4 inches of reinforced concrete, or erased by the failing cells of a killer's brain. The city of Phoenix had survived its deepest, longest confrontation with the ghosts of its own expansion, turning an urban legend into an active, living monument to the absolute duty of remembrance, leaving behind an empty, sunlit lot in the suburbs, a family resting in the peace of a marked grave, and a ground that had finally, and for all time, come home to the light. The arrival of the first winter following the formal conclusion of the state's case against Raymond Vance marked the beginning of a profound, silent stagnation within the bureaucratic channels of the Maricopa County justice system. The intense, high-octane media attention that had illuminated the courthouse steps during the reading of Chloe Mercer's diary entries had entirely evaporated, leaving behind the cold, clinical reality of an administrative transition. In the records division, the thick manila folders that had spent 25 years labeled under the active status of an unresolved kidnapping were systematically stamped with the flat, bloodless ink of an official closure. The file was digitized, backed up across 3 distinct federal servers, and transferred to the permanent historical vaults, a series of mechanical, computerized actions that effectively transformed the Valley's most haunting urban ghost story into a static, completed dataset that would never again trigger an active patrol car or an emergency tip log. For Marcus Thorne, the senior cold case analyst whose decade of unyielding digital archaeology had pulled the corporate storage unit safe out of the dark, the end of the public trial brought no sense of immediate professional triumph. He found himself sitting in the dimmed, subterranean light of his office at the Cold Case Bureau, surrounded by the empty plastic tubs that had previously held the disorganized, crumbling physical evidence of the 2001 investigation. The sprawling whiteboard on the wall, which had once been covered in a complex, interlocking maze of corporate HVAC licenses, property management shift charts, and historical weather data, had been completely wiped clean. In its place sat the standard, unglamorous metrics of the Bureau's next legacy assignment, an old, unidentified body report from the late 90s that had been recovered from a dry irrigation canal near Mesa. Thorne understood better than anyone in the department that the resolution of the Vance case was not an occasion for structural self-congratulation, but a terrifying warning about the millions of other unresolved data points sitting unexamined in the municipal archives. The success of the Mercer Protocol had rapidly transformed Thorne into a sought-after authority within the national law enforcement community, forcing him to spend his weeks traveling to criminal justice academies across the country to demonstrate the mechanics of his data integration workflows. He stood before rooms of junior detectives, utilizing the exact timeline of Raymond Vance's 25-year camouflage to illustrate how an expanding, transient city can inadvertently protect a predator by failing to maintain the absolute continuity of its historical records. The killer didn't survive because he was a criminal mastermind, Thorne told a packed lecture hall of state troopers on a cold Tuesday morning. He survived because the system allowed his name to exist in 3 separate, uncommunicative databases. He was a licensed contractor in one, a registered voter in another, and a suspect in a third, and it took a quarter of a century for the technology to catch up to the gap. Our job is to make sure that gap never opens again. While Thorne worked to institutionalize the technical lessons of the case, the suburban block in North Phoenix, where Vance had lived out his pristine retirement, was experiencing a slow, agonizing process of social decay. The physical space where house number 1142 had stood was now entirely empty, a flat, rectangular scar of clean gravel and native desert plants that offered absolutely no architectural texture for the eye to catch on. The city had completed the total removal of the detached workshop, the concrete foundation, and the underlying soil that had been contaminated by the quicklime bath, leaving behind a geographic vacuum that seemed to radiate a cold, defensive silence into the surrounding cul-de-sac. The families who lived on either side of the open lot found themselves trapped in a state of hypervigilant paranoia, unable to look out their front windows without being forced to confront the absolute transparency of the deception that had lived right next door to their children for 2 decades. The cognitive dissonance within the neighborhood was a slow-acting poison that systematically corrupted the basic mechanics of communal trust. Neighbors who had spent 20 years borrowing mechanical tools from Vance, standing at his backyard grill, and voting for him during the annual Homeowners Association meetings could no longer look at each other without a subtle, defensive undercurrent of suspicion. They began to question their own instincts, analyzing every past interaction with a quiet old grandfather through a retrospective lens of profound cynicism. If a man could fix your broken air conditioning unit, volunteer at the municipal library, and kiss his grandchildren on the cheek while a 19-year-old college student lay sealed in an industrial drum 5 feet below his active workbench, then the entire concept of ordinary human reliability was an illusion. The front drapes of the street remained drawn, the backyard pool parties were quietly canceled, and the neighborhood transitioned into a sterile, defensive enclave where every closed garage door was viewed as a potential repository for a hidden atrocity. For Toby Jenkins, the sudden, mechanical termination of the investigation brought an existential stasis that threatened to completely derail his transition into ordinary civilian life. He had spent his entire adult existence operating as the primary, self-appointed custodian of his cousin's memory, his daily schedule structured around the frantic, analytical pursuit of any scrap of paper or old property lead that could shed light on the night of August 12, 2001. Now that the search had ended with the definitive horizontal reality of a concrete floor and a vintage mechanical wrench, the driving engine of his identity was gone, leaving him stranded in a quiet, modern world that he no longer knew how to navigate. He found himself walking through the empty, sun-bleached rooms of his late grandmother's bungalow, looking at the faded patches of paint where his maps and timelines had once been pinned to the plaster, feeling a deep, physical exhaustion that separated him entirely from the forward-moving ambitions of his peers. He had won the long, grueling war against the silence of the desert, but he had arrived at the finish line entirely hollowed out, his youth having been completely consumed by the grit and the dust of the archives. The university apartment complex on the western side of the valley had completely completed its multi-million-dollar structural renovation, entirely erasing the physical landmarks that Vance had exploited under the cover of the 2001 monsoon storm. The outdated wooden stairwells and the narrow, unlit service alleyways where the industrial maintenance truck had idled in the dead of night were replaced by a modern, open-air brick plaza equipped with high-intensity LED illumination and an automated, biometric access network that monitored every entry point into the building. The current generation of students who occupied the units moved through the bright, neon-lit common spaces with the casual, untroubled indifference of individuals who had no personal memory of the year 2001. They looked at the polished bronze memorial plaque that had been installed near the entrance of the biology lab, a simple marker bearing the name Chloe Mercer and the years of her brief life, as an abstract historical curiosity, completely unaware that the total security infrastructure they relied on every single night had been paid for with the blood of a girl who had once sat in the very same lecture halls. Inside the high-security medical ward of the state penitentiary near the Mexican border, the man who had detonated this structural transformation across the valley was experiencing his own total eviction from the human record. Raymond Vance was no longer a name, a neighbor, or a father. He was an administrative classification on a set of plastic wristbands, his daily movements managed by a clinical team of correctional guards who treated him with the bloodless efficiency of an ordinary industrial variable. The vascular dementia that had begun to rot his neural pathways during the closing months of the trial had advanced with a rapid, merciless velocity, systematically erasing the remaining fragments of his personal history and his awareness of the present day. He spent his hours sitting in a mobile restraint chair beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of a windowless concrete cell, his long, scarred fingers moving rhythmically against his knees as if he were still adjusting the valves on an old refrigeration compressor in the dark workspace of his North Phoenix home. He was a prisoner of his own failing biology, entirely insulated from the public hatred and the systemic changes his crimes had caused, drifting toward a quiet, unremarked death in the absolute dark of an institutional void. The true crime podcasters, independent documentary crews, and digital sleuths who had turned the steps of the Maricopa County Courthouse into an active, high-intensity content market had completely packed away their equipment, long since deploying their vans to newer, more volatile crime scenes in distant states. The story of Chloe Mercer had officially migrated out of the volatile realm of public consumption and settled permanently into the sterile, analytical framework of forensic science institutes and university law libraries, cited in research papers as the classic reference case for legacy-linked data synergy and delayed osteological recovery under extreme environmental pressure. The focus of the academic discourse remained fixed on the unique preservation dynamics inside the polyethylene chemical drum, analyzing how the high alkaline environment created by the quicklime had inadvertently prevented the environmental degradation of the bone marrow, allowing modern sequencing units to extract a flawless genetic profile 25 years after the soft tissues had been completely destroyed by the chemical reaction. As the late winter sun began to drop behind the rugged, volcanic ridges of the mountains surrounding the Phoenix Basin, casting long, dramatic geometric shadows across the vast, interlocking network of service roads and suburban cul-de-sacs, the ultimate historical resolution of the 2001 cold case became quietly, unforgettably clear to those who had lived through its duration. The narrative had never been about the mechanical precision of a hydraulic shop press or the sudden, accidental convenience of a code enforcement inspection at an abandoned commercial storage facility. It was an epic, universal proof of the absolute, inescapable authority of the human record. It served as an unshakable declaration that every act of premeditated violence leaves an permanent, historical print on the world, a faint but persistent resonance that cannot be fully neutralized by industrial chemicals, hidden beneath 4 inches of reinforced concrete, or erased by the failing cells of a killer's brain. The city of Phoenix had survived its deepest, longest confrontation with the ghosts of its own expansion, turning an urban legend into an active, living monument to the absolute duty of remembrance, leaving behind an empty, sunlit lot in the suburbs, a family resting in the peace of a marked grave, and a ground that had finally, and for all time, come home to the light. The passage into the second winter following the historic sentencing of Raymond Vance did not bring a dramatic renewal of public interest, but rather anchored the Phoenix 2001 cold case deeper into the structural and legal architecture of the state of Arizona. The valley had long since transitioned past the volatile media cycles that had once transformed the Maricopa County Courthouse steps into an arena of sensationalized true crime broadcasts. The modern metropolis continued its relentless, upward trajectory of glass, steel, and concrete, burying the architectural remnants of the early 2000s beneath a vast wave of new suburban developments and master-planned commercial zones. Yet, for the individuals whose professional and personal lives had been irrevocably altered by the discovery inside Storage Unit 104, the resolution of the mystery had settled into a heavy, permanent baseline, a cold, unyielding reality where the truth was no longer an object of active pursuit, but a foundational law of the city's historical record. Inside the Records Division of the Phoenix Police Department, the physical manifestation of case number 01-11942 had undergone its final, administrative mutation. The thick, weathered cardboard boxes that had once held the disorganized fragments of the original 2001 missing persons file, the handwritten field notes, the grainy Polaroids of the unmade bed, and the conflicting witness statements from an overstretched precinct were officially cleared from the active staging tables. They had been replaced by a highly secure, centralized digital directory, cataloged under the permanent status of a cleared capital homicide investigation. The data was replicated across multiple secure state servers, ensuring that the granular details of how a predatory HVAC technician managed to evade detection for a quarter of a century would remain perfectly preserved as an instructional blueprint for future generations of criminal intelligence analysts. The file was closed, the field logs were silent, but the systemic lessons extracted from the failure of the early 90s infrastructure had become a mandatory component of the Academy's core curriculum. Marcus Thorne sat beneath the dimmed fluorescent lights of his newly expanded office at the Cold Case Bureau, his eyes tracking the automated metrics of the state's active legacy databases. The massive, interlocking whiteboard that had once held the chronological map of Raymond Vance's corporate movements, his ventilation contracting licenses, and the historical weather patterns of August 2001 had been wiped clean, replaced by a streamlined array of digital monitors tracking current missing person anomalies across the Southwest. Thorne had successfully transitioned from an obsessive, isolated investigator working the margins of a forgotten file to the administrative director of the regional task force, a position that required him to manage the ongoing implementation of the Mercer Analytical Index. His daily routine was no longer driven by the frantic search for a hidden storage safe or a buried chemical drum. He was now the primary architect of a predictive system designed to ensure that the bureaucratic blind spots Vance had exploited would never again open within the city's expanding grid. He spent his mornings conducting advanced seminars for senior homicide detectives from neighboring jurisdictions, utilizing the exact technical breakthroughs of the Vance case to demonstrate the necessity of continuous, proactive archival integration. We cannot afford to treat a cold case as a static artifact that sits waiting for a random tip or an accidental discovery, Thorne told a group of visiting investigators from Tucson during a structured briefing. The resolution of the 2001 file proved that the evidence of a crime is almost always hidden within the routine, ignored metadata of the city itself, in the property management logs, the commercial vehicle registries, and the corporate tax dissolutions that sit unread in the state archives. Our department didn't catch Raymond Vance because we found a new witness. We caught him because we built an algorithmic bridge that connected his public identity to his private crimes before his own cognitive decline could insulate him from the law. While Thorne worked to codify these operational mechanics into the institutional memory of the state, the residential street in North Phoenix, where Vance had maintained his pristine suburban camouflage, had reached a state of complete, protective isolation. The flat, rectangular plot of land where house number 1142 had once stood remained entirely clear of any residential structures, its surface covered in a uniform layer of desert gravel and native, drought-resistant landscaping that offered no visual texture for the casual eye to linger on. The Municipal Code Enforcement Division had placed a permanent zoning restriction on the parcel, ensuring that no future real estate developer could ever pour a new foundation or drill into the subsoil where the industrial-grade polyethylene chemical drum had spent 25 years buried beneath the workshop floor. The open space had been effectively neutralized, a geographic void on the block that served as a silent, persistent reminder of the absolute transparency of evil that had lived right next door to the community's children for 2 decades. The social dynamics of the cul-de-sac had undergone a permanent, structural hardening that completely altered the way the remaining residents interacted with their surroundings. The initial shock and defensive denial that had characterized the neighborhood during the opening hours of the police excavation had long since turned into a quiet, hypervigilant cynicism that infected the basic mechanics of communal trust. Neighbors who had spent 20 years standing at Vance's backyard grill, borrowing his mechanical tools, and trusting him with the duplicate keys to their properties could no longer look at an ordinary, helpful gesture from a fellow citizen without a subtle, defensive layer of suspicion flaring in their minds. They had been forced to accept the terrifying reality that the mask of a dedicated grandfather, a reliable community volunteer, and an impeccable neighbor could be worn with flawless precision by a calculated predator for half a lifetime, rendering the entire concept of ordinary human reliability completely obsolete. The front curtains of the street remained drawn, the impromptu block parties were a thing of the past, and the neighborhood had settled into a sterile, watchful routine where safety was no longer a passive assumption, but a vigilant, defensive calculation. On the western side of the valley, the university housing complex, where Chloe Mercer had spent her final hours, had successfully completed its transition into a modern, high-density student residential plaza, its architectural layout specifically designed to eliminate the physical vulnerabilities Vance had exploited under the cover of the 2001 monsoon storm. The narrow, unlit service alleyways and the outdated exterior wooden stairwells where the industrial maintenance truck had idled in the dead of night had been entirely demolished, replaced by an open, glass-fronted courtyard equipped with high-intensity LED illumination systems and an automated, biometric access control network that monitored every single entry point into the buildings. The current generation of undergraduates who moved through the bright, air-conditioned common spaces did so with the total, casual indifference of individuals who had no personal memory of the year 2001. Their conversations focused strictly on their upcoming biology exams and their weekend plans. They walked past the polished bronze memorial plaque near the entrance of the main laboratory building, a simple, elegant marker bearing Chloe's name and the years of her brief life, treating it as an abstract historical curiosity, completely blind to the fact that the absolute security infrastructure they relied on every night had been built on the wreckage of a life stolen because those precise tools did not exist. Inside the clinical, high-security medical ward of the state penitentiary near the Mexican border, the man who had detonated this structural transformation across the state was experiencing his own total eviction from the human record. Raymond Vance was no longer a name, a father, or a neighbor. He had been reduced to an alphanumeric classification on a plastic wristband, his daily physical survival managed by a clinical team of correctional guards who treated him with the bloodless efficiency of an ordinary industrial variable. The vascular dementia that had begun to destroy his neural pathways during the closing months of the trial had advanced with a rapid, merciless velocity, systematically erasing the remaining fragments of his personal history, his awareness of the courtroom proceedings, and his memory of the university apartment complex. He spent his hours sitting in a mobile restraint chair beneath the harsh, unyielding fluorescent lights of a windowless concrete cell, his long, grease-stained fingers moving rhythmically against his knees as if he were still adjusting the valves on an old refrigeration compressor in the dark workspace of his North Phoenix home. He was a prisoner of his own failing biology, entirely insulated from the public hatred and the systemic changes his crimes had caused across the valley, a hollow shell drifting toward an uncelebrated, quiet death in the absolute dark of an institutional void. The true crime podcasters, independent documentary crews, and digital sleuths who had briefly turned the steps of the Maricopa County Courthouse into an active, high-intensity content market during the presentation of the diary entries had long since packed away their equipment, moving their production vans and satellite arrays to newer, more volatile crime scenes in distant states. The story of Chloe Mercer had officially migrated out of the volatile realm of public consumption and settled permanently into the sterile, analytical framework of forensic science institutes and university law libraries, cited in research papers as the classic reference case for legacy-linked data synergy and delayed osteological recovery under extreme environmental pressure. The focus of the academic discourse remained fixed on the unique preservation dynamics inside the polyethylene chemical drum, analyzing how the high-alkaline environment created by the quicklime had inadvertently prevented the environmental degradation of the bone marrow, allowing modern sequencing units to extract a flawless genetic profile 25 years after the soft tissues had been completely destroyed by the chemical reaction. As the late winter sun began to drop behind the rugged, volcanic ridges of the mountains surrounding the Phoenix Basin, casting long, dramatic geometric shadows across the vast, interlocking network of service roads and suburban cul-de-sacs, the ultimate historical resolution of the 2001 cold case became quietly, unforgettably clear to those who had lived through its duration. The narrative had never been about the mechanical precision of a hydraulic shop press or the sudden, accidental convenience of a code enforcement inspection at an abandoned commercial storage facility. It was an epic, universal proof of the absolute, inescapable authority of the human record. It served as an unshakable declaration that every act of premeditated violence leaves an permanent, historical print on the world, a faint but persistent resonance that cannot be fully neutralized by industrial chemicals, hidden beneath 4 inches of reinforced concrete, or erased by the failing cells of a killer's brain. The city of Phoenix had survived its deepest, longest confrontation with the ghosts of its own expansion, turning an urban legend into an active, living monument to the absolute duty of remembrance, leaving behind an empty, sunlit lot in the suburbs, a family resting in the peace of a marked grave, and a ground that had finally, and for all time, come home to the light. The progression into the third year of the post-trial era solidified the legacy of the Chloe Mercer investigation, shifting it entirely out of the realm of local true crime history and into the permanent framework of national judicial policy. In the city of Phoenix, the frantic, high-adrenaline atmosphere that had characterized the 2026 excavation of Raymond Vance's workshop had transitioned into a profound, institutional stillness. The Maricopa County Homicide Division no longer held active briefings regarding case number 01-11942. The files had been bound, indexed, and integrated into the Federal Judicial Archive as a landmark study in legacy-linked data recovery. The system had fulfilled its punitive mandate. The predator had been unmasked, his suburban camouflage stripped away, and his physical autonomy terminated by the highest courts of the state. Yet the structural transformation triggered by that water-damaged leather journal continued to execute a silent, revolutionary pressure on the mechanics of American law enforcement. Inside the data centers of the Southwest Forensic Science Consortium, the technological infrastructure that Marcus Thorne had pioneered was being expanded into a multi-state network designed to permanently eliminate the archival blind spots of the late 20th century. The automated indexing programs were no longer restricted to matching local HVAC certification records against unresolved missing persons files. They were now authorized to sweep through decades of interstate commercial vehicle logs, regional utility infrastructure audits, and defunct corporate property leases across Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California. This digital dragnet operated continuously in the background of the region's justice system, running high-volume, predictive analytics through the uncatalogued metadata of an era before digital tracking became the baseline of public safety. The Mercer Index had effectively shifted the paradigm of cold case units from a passive stance of waiting for a random tip to an aggressive, systemic strategy of data-driven excavation, ensuring that time could no longer be used as a reliable insulation strategy by legacy predators. For Toby Jenkins, who had spent his entire developmental life functioning as the primary custodian of his cousin's memory, the third anniversary of the sentencing brought a quiet, anatomical liberation that allowed him to finally participate in the forward momentum of the living world. He had closed the small, sun-bleached bungalow where his grandmother had spent her final years, transferring the remaining boxes of historical records and old newspaper clippings to the university's permanent historical archive. His daily life was no longer structured around the frantic, cyclical analysis of the 7 minutes it took Vance to navigate the service roads behind the apartment complex in August of 2001. The absolute, horizontal reality of the workshop floor and the marked grave beneath the cemetery oak tree had provided a definitive boundary line for his grief. He had relocated to the coast, taking a position with an environmental surveying firm that allowed him to spend his days mapping the clean, uncorrupted horizons of the Pacific Northwest, his mind finally cleared of the grit, the dust, and the toxic secrets of the Maricopa County Archives. The vacant lot at number 1142, Oak Ridge Lane, had reached a state of complete, natural integration with the surrounding suburban topography, its surface now completely covered by a dense, uniform layer of crushed desert granite and native, drought-resistant flora that required no human maintenance to survive. The municipal zoning restrictions placed on the parcel had successfully resisted several attempts by commercial real estate firms to reacquire the land, ensuring that the ground where the polyethylene chemical drum had spent 25 years buried beneath a 4-ton shop press would remain forever open to the Arizona sky. The neighboring families had slowly begun to adapt to the geographic vacuum on their block, the presence of the open space transitioning from a source of acute, paranoid anxiety into a quiet, monumental landscape that represented the neighborhood's survival of a profound domestic deception. The front curtains of the street were gradually being drawn back, the ordinary sounds of suburban life returned to the cul-de-sac, and the memory of the helpful old mechanic who had fixed their air conditioning units was systematically overwritten by the daily, unhurried routines of a new generation of residents. The University Apartment Plaza, which had been entirely remodeled to eliminate the physical vulnerabilities Vance had exploited under the cover of the 2001 dust storm, stood as a vibrant, high-density center of campus life, its architectural design serving as a physical manifestation of the Mercer Doctrine. The bright, glass-fronted common spaces, high-intensity LED illumination arrays, and automated biometric access portals monitored every movement with a cold, bloodless efficiency that left no blind spots for an opportunistic predator to occupy. The current undergraduate biology students who crowded into the nearby lecture halls moved through the complex with the total, casual confidence of a generation that had never known a world without continuous digital surveillance. They passed the polished bronze memorial plaque near the entrance of the laboratory building with an abstract, respectful glance, treating the name Chloe Mercer as an emblem of historical institutional progress rather than a contemporary tragedy. Entirely blind to the reality that the absolute safety they enjoyed every night had been purchased with the life of a young woman who had recorded her own execution in the pages of a hand-locked leather diary. Inside the high-security medical wing of the state penitentiary near the Mexican border, the physical frame of Raymond Vance was rapidly approaching its ultimate, biological termination in a condition of absolute, unremarked isolation. The 67-year-old inmate was no longer capable of recognizing his own name or articulating a coherent response to the routine diagnostic evaluations of the correctional staff, his remaining neural pathways having been completely hollowed out by the advanced, merciless velocity of his vascular dementia. He spent his days secured in a high-backed mobility chair within a sterile, windowless concrete unit, his long, scarred fingers tracing repetitive, mechanical geometric patterns against his uniform as if he were still adjusting the valves on a phantom refrigeration compressor in the dark workspace of his old North Phoenix home. The State Corrections Department maintained his high-security classification as a matter of administrative protocol, but the surveillance was entirely mechanical, a silent guard monitoring a camera feed that showed an old man staring blankly at the concrete wall, completely insulated from the public hatred and the systemic revolutions his crimes had detonated across the state. The true crime podcasters, independent media crews, and digital sleuths who had briefly transformed the county courthouse steps into a high-intensity content market had completely vacated the valley, their production trailers long since deployed to newer, more volatile crime scenes in distant jurisdictions. The narrative of the Phoenix 2001 cold case had officially transitioned out of the volatile realm of public consumption and settled permanently into the sterile, analytical framework of forensic science institutes and university law libraries, cited in research papers as the classic reference case for legacy-linked data synergy and delayed osteological recovery under extreme environmental pressure. The focus of the academic discourse remained fixed on the unique preservation dynamics inside the polyethylene chemical drum, analyzing how the high alkaline environment created by the quicklime had inadvertently prevented the environmental degradation of the bone marrow, allowing modern sequencing units to extract a flawless genetic profile 25 years after the soft tissues had been completely destroyed by the chemical reaction. As the late afternoon sun of July 2026 began to drop behind the rugged, volcanic ridges of the mountains surrounding the Phoenix Basin, casting long, dramatic geometric shadows across the vast, interlocking network of service roads and suburban cul-de-sacs, the ultimate historical resolution of the 2001 cold case became quietly, unforgettably clear to those who had lived through its duration. The narrative had never been about the mechanical precision of a hydraulic shop press or the sudden, accidental convenience of a code enforcement inspection at an abandoned commercial storage facility. It was an epic, universal proof of the absolute, inescapable authority of the human record. It served as an unshakable declaration that every act of premeditated violence leaves an permanent, historical print on the world, a faint but persistent resonance that cannot be fully neutralized by industrial chemicals, hidden beneath 4 inches of reinforced concrete, or erased by the failing cells of a killer's brain. The city of Phoenix had survived its deepest, longest confrontation with the ghosts of its own expansion, turning an urban legend into an active, living monument to the absolute duty of remembrance, leaving behind an empty, sunlit lot in the suburbs, a family resting in the peace of a marked grave, and a ground that had finally, and for all time, come home to the light. The progression into the 4th year following the conviction of Raymond Vance marked a definitive transition from the era of active legal retribution to the era of permanent institutional integration. Across the vast, sun-bleached grid of the Phoenix metropolitan area, The historical details of case number 01-11942 had officially decoupled from the volatile daily news cycle, settling deeply into the baseline architecture of municipal governance and forensic science. The Maricopa County Homicide Division no longer held periodic press briefings or emergency strategy sessions regarding the events of August 2001. The folders were bound, indexed, and cross-referenced within the state's supreme legal repository. The system had successfully completed its punitive cycle. The killer had been processed, his domestic camouflage dismantled, and his physical autonomy terminated by the state. Yet the structural paradigm shift ignited by the recovery of Chloe Mercer's hand-locked journal continued to exert a silent, continuous pressure on the mechanics of American law enforcement. Inside the administrative headquarters of the Southwest Forensic Science Consortium, the technological workflows that Marcus Thorne had pioneered were being codified into a standardized federal curriculum. The automated database algorithms were no longer classified as experimental, localized tools. They were now operationalized as a mandatory defensive layer across multiple state lines. This digital network operated continuously in the background of the region's justice systems, running high-volume, predictive analytics through the forgotten metadata of an era before digital cloud tracking became the baseline of public safety. The Mercer Index had effectively inverted the traditional approach of cold case units, shifting them from a reactive stance of waiting for a random citizen tip to an aggressive, systemic strategy of data-driven excavation. The system had finally accepted that the evidence of a legacy crime does not simply vanish into the past. It remains trapped within the unread property records, defunct commercial corporate listings, and administrative anomalies of the city itself, waiting for the correct analytical interface to pull it into the light. Marcus Thorne spent his mornings within the climate-controlled command suites of the Bureau, his daily responsibilities focused on supervising the systematic digitization of the region's remaining 20th-century police archives. His old workspace, which had once been defined by a chaotic maze of physical maps, tattered newspaper clippings, and index cards from the pre-digital era, had been completely streamlined into a series of high-definition data arrays tracking historical anomalies across the Southwest. Thorne had successfully transitioned from an isolated investigator working the margins of a forgotten file to the regional director of the Legacy Task Force, a position that allowed him to ensure that the bureaucratic blind spots Raymond Vance had exploited would never again open within the valley's expanding grid. He no longer chased the phantoms of individual suspects or monitored the timelines of specific corridors. He had become the ultimate custodian of the city's historical memory, operating with the clinical understanding that the preservation of the data is the ultimate foundation of public safety. He conducted regular, multi-agency briefings for visiting homicide commanders from across the country, utilizing the exact technical breakthroughs of the 2001 resolution to demonstrate the absolute necessity of continuous archival maintenance. The Predator did not evade our department for 25 years because he possessed an advanced criminal intelligence, Thorne noted during a structured training seminar. He survived because our records infrastructure allowed his public identity to exist in total isolation from his private actions. He was a licensed utility contractor in one state ledger, a registered property specialist in another, and an unindexed name in a missing person tip log. The resolution of this case proved that time is not a neutral coordinate that washes away the evidence. It is a data matrix that will always yield the truth if the state maintains the integrity of the chain of custody. While Thorne worked to institutionalize these operational mechanics, the suburban block in North Phoenix, where Vance had maintained his immaculate retirement fortress, had achieved a state of quiet, ordinary stabilization. The flat, rectangular plot of land where house number 1142 had once stood was completely integrated into the natural topography of the valley, its surface covered in a uniform layer of crushed desert granite and native, drought-resistant landscaping that required no human maintenance to survive. The Municipal Code Enforcement Division had placed a permanent zoning restriction on the parcel, legally ensuring that no future real estate developer could ever acquire the land to pour a new concrete foundation or drill into the subsoil, where the industrial chemical container had spent a quarter of a century hidden beneath the workshop floor. The open space had become a neutral zone on the street, an architectural void that served as a silent, monumental testament to the neighborhood's survival of a profound domestic deception. The social fabric of the cul-de-sac had undergone a complete, generational reset. The acute paranoia and defensive isolation that had characterized the months of the forensic excavation slowly giving way to the ordinary, unhurried routines of working-class civilian life. Many of the families who had lived side by side with Vance during his 20 years of suburban camouflaging had quietly sold their properties and moved away from the valley, replaced by a new cohort of homeowners who possessed no personal connection to the trauma of 2026. The new residents walked down the sidewalks and parked their vehicles without looking at the hedges with suspicion, their understanding of the block colored by the pleasant, sunlit reality of the present day rather than the grim, historical revelations of the workshop floor. The neighborhood had successfully overwritten the narrative of the predator, proving that the collective resilience of a community is always more durable than the calculated secrets of the monsters who attempt to hide within its architecture. On the western side of the valley, the university student housing complex stood as a vibrant, high-density center of campus life, its structural layout serving as a physical manifestation of the Mercer Doctrine's emphasis on defensive design. The outdated wooden stairwells, dark courtyard alcoves, and narrow service alleyways where Vance had staged his commercial vehicle under the cover of the 2001 dust storm had been entirely replaced by an open, glass-fronted pedestrian plaza equipped with high-intensity LED illumination arrays and an automated access control network. The current generation of undergraduate biology students who crowded into the nearby laboratories moved through the complex with the total, casual confidence of individuals who had never known a world without continuous digital surveillance. They passed the polished bronze memorial plaque near the entrance of the building with an abstract, respectful glance, treating the name Chloe Mercer as an emblem of historical institutional progress rather than a contemporary tragedy. Entirely blind to the reality that the absolute safety they enjoyed every night had been purchased with the life of a young woman who had recorded her own execution in the pages of a hand-locked leather diary. Inside the high-security medical wing of the state penitentiary near the Mexican border, the physical frame of Raymond Vance was rapidly approaching its ultimate, biological termination in a condition of absolute, uncelebrated isolation. The old inmate was no longer capable of recognizing his own name or articulating a coherent response to the routine diagnostic evaluations of the correctional staff, his remaining neural pathways having been completely hollowed out by the advanced, merciless velocity of his vascular dementia. He spent his days secured in a high-backed mobility chair within a sterile, windowless concrete unit, his long, scarred fingers tracing repetitive, mechanical geometric patterns against his uniform as if he were still adjusting the valves on a phantom refrigeration compressor in the dark workspace of his old North Phoenix home. The State Corrections Department maintained his high-security classification as a matter of administrative protocol, but the surveillance was entirely mechanical, a silent guard monitoring a camera feed that showed an old man staring blankly at the concrete wall, completely insulated from the public hatred and the systemic revolutions his crimes had detonated across the state. The true crime podcasters, independent media crews, and digital sleuths who had briefly transformed the county courthouse steps into a high-intensity content market had completely vacated the valley, their production trailers long since deployed to newer, more volatile crime scenes in distant jurisdictions. The narrative of the Phoenix 2001 cold case had officially transitioned out of the volatile realm of public consumption and settled permanently into the sterile, analytical framework of forensic science institutes and university law libraries, cited in research papers as the classic reference case for legacy-linked data synergy and delayed osteological recovery under extreme environmental pressure. The focus of the academic discourse remained fixed on the unique preservation dynamics inside the polyethylene chemical drum, analyzing how the high alkaline environment created by the quicklime had inadvertently prevented the environmental degradation of the bone marrow, allowing modern sequencing units to extract a flawless genetic profile 25 years after the soft tissues had been completely destroyed by the chemical reaction. As the late afternoon sun began to drop behind the rugged, volcanic ridges of the mountains surrounding the Phoenix Basin, casting long, dramatic geometric shadows across the vast, interlocking network of service roads and suburban cul-de-sacs, the ultimate historical resolution of the 2001 cold case became quietly, unforgettably clear to those who had lived through its duration. The narrative had never been about the mechanical precision of a hydraulic shop press or the sudden, accidental convenience of a code enforcement inspection at an abandoned commercial storage facility. It was an epic, universal proof of the absolute, inescapable authority of the human record. It served as an unshakable declaration that every act of premeditated violence leaves an permanent, historical print on the world, a faint but persistent resonance that cannot be fully neutralized by industrial chemicals, hidden beneath 4 inches of reinforced concrete, or erased by the failing cells of a killer's brain. The city of Phoenix had survived its deepest, longest confrontation with the ghosts of its own expansion, turning an urban legend into an active, living monument to the absolute duty of remembrance, leaving behind an empty, sunlit lot in the suburbs, a family resting in the peace of a marked grave, and a ground that had finally, and for all time, come home to the light. The passage into the 5th year since the definitive resolution of the Phoenix 2001 cold case arrived not with the sharp, volatile velocity of breaking news, but with the steady, heavy permanence of an unalterable historical archive. Across the sprawling, heat-shrunk metropolitan basin of the valley, the natural transition of the seasons had slowly begun to dull the raw, public memories of the 2026 excavation, burying the sensational headlines beneath the constant, relentless forward momentum of modern suburban development. At the Maricopa County Courthouse, the name Chloe Mercer had officially migrated from the high-priority legal briefs into the bound volumes of permanent state case law, serving as a landmark precedent for prosecutors navigating the complex, fragile logistics of legacy litigation. The justice system had completed its mechanical obligations. The indictment had been read, the water-damaged ledger had been authenticated, the verdict had been delivered, and the sentence had been locked into the state's correctional matrix. Yet the structural ripple effects of that 25-year silence continued to define the institutional and cultural fabric of the city. Inside the technical headquarters of the Phoenix Police Department, the Specialized Cold Case Bureau stood as a direct, physical manifestation of the lessons extracted from the long failure to identify Raymond Vance during the early 2000s. The division had completely abandoned the isolated, paper-based archiving methods that had allowed the killer's corporate vehicle registries and maintenance logs to sit unexamined in separate municipal basements, replacing the old infrastructure with an aggressive, highly integrated digital architecture. Every piece of legacy evidence, every handwritten field report from the pre-digital era, and every piece of latent biometric data had been systematically converted into a dynamic, searchable network that connected anomalies across decades of valley history. Investigators no longer viewed their assignments through the narrow lens of individual, isolated incidents. They operated with the absolute understanding that time is a porous barrier and that the modern tools of forensic analysis are only as effective as the state's willingness to maintain the absolute continuity of its historical data. Marcus Thorne, whose persistent digital archaeology had originally unraveled Vance's decades of suburban camouflage, spent his days guiding a new generation of analysts through the meticulous, often tedious process of cold case reconstruction. His permanent appointment to a senior strategic role within the Bureau had not lessened his deep, instinctual focus on the mechanics of systemic accountability. He remained a quiet, intense presence in the data center, his monitors continuously running automated sweeps through the region's remaining 20th century archives. He knew that the success of the Mercer investigation was not a cause for professional self-congratulation, but a stark, undeniable warning about the fragility of public safety in a rapidly expanding metropolitan zone. He regularly conducted advanced seminars at the State Training Academy, utilizing the exact timeline of the 2001 file to illustrate how an overstretched precinct can inadvertently protect a predator by allowing a single, high-priority tip to slip into the blind spots of an administrative triad. For the surviving branches of the Mercer family, residing thousands of miles away from the blistering heat of the Arizona desert, the 5th anniversary of the post-trial era brought a level of emotional stabilization that had been entirely unimaginable during the chaotic months of the arrest. The physical and psychological distance from the landmarks of Phoenix had allowed Toby Jenkins to finally dismantle the defensive, analytical armor he had worn since his early youth, transitioning from a state of continuous, hypervigilance seeking into a state of quiet, self-directed remembrance. Chloe was no longer a phantom defined exclusively by the horrific details of her abduction or the sterile, clinical evidence containers displayed before a jury box. She had been fully restored to her family as a complete human being, a daughter and a cousin whose life was remembered for its warmth, its brilliance, and the quiet, persistent love that had outlasted the silence of her grave. They had successfully severed the connection between her memory and the predator who had attempted to erase her, achieving a sense of internal sovereignty that no legal verdict could ever fully provide. In the northern suburbs of the city, the residential streets of the subdivision where Raymond Vance had spent 20 years cultivating the image of an exemplary community volunteer had finally settled into a state of ordinary, unhurried normalcy. The flat, rectangular plot of land where house number 1142 had once stood was completely integrated into the natural topography of the cul-de-sac, its surface covered in a uniform layer of crushed desert granite and native, drought-resistant landscaping that required no human maintenance to survive. The Municipal Code Enforcement Division had maintained a permanent zoning restriction on the parcel, ensuring that no future real estate developer could ever acquire the land to pour a new concrete foundation or drill into the subsoil, where the chemical container had spent a quarter of a century hidden beneath the workshop floor. The open space had become a neutral zone on the street, an architectural void that served as a silent, monumental testament to the neighborhood's survival of a profound domestic deception. The social fabric of the cul-de-sac had undergone a complete, generational reset. The acute paranoia and defensive isolation that had characterized